It's past midnight now, and you're here again, phone glowing softly in the dark, looking for something to ease you toward sleep. The house has settled into its quiet sounds, that particular stillness that only comes after everyone else has gone to bed. And here we are together in this small pocket of time that belongs to no one but us. Comment down below how many nights you've been watching for. Most people think they know the Spider Man story. They think it's about radioactive spiders, about great power and great responsibility, about a teenager who gets bit and learns to swing through Manhattan. But that's not quite right, not entirely. The real story of Spider Man in cinema isn't about any single moment of transformation or any particular villain defeated. It's about something stranger and more persistent. It's about how the same story kept getting told over and over by different people who each thought they understood what made Peter Parker matter. Each time, they were partly right and partly wrong, and each time, the character survived their interpretation and waited for the next one. 22 years of movies, three different actors, three different visions of what it means to be bitten by something that changes you forever. That's what we're really looking at when we trace this story from beginning to end. We'll move through all of it tonight, from Tobey Maguire's first awkward stumble into heroism, all the way through Tom Holland's integration into a universe bigger than any single character. We'll take it slow, without any particular rush. This isn't a countdown or a ranking of which movies worked and which didn't. It's just the story, told in the order it happened, with attention paid to the small moments that reveal who these people thought Spider Man was supposed to be. The casting choices that seemed obvious in hindsight but were controversial at the time. The villains who worked and the ones who didn't, and why. The way each trilogy tried to solve the problems of the one that came before it and created new problems in the process. If you want to subscribe, that's fine. No pressure. It'll still be here when you wake up tomorrow. So let's begin where it actually began, not with a spider bite in a high school hallway, but with a phone call in 1999. Sam Raimi wasn't supposed to make a Spider Man movie. He was the guy who made horror films about evil trees and Bruce Campbell getting his hand chopped off. He was weird and inventive and had never directed anything that cost more than $15 million. But Avi Arad, who ran Marvel's film division back when it was still a scrappy operation, trying to prove that comic book movies could be more than camp, had seen what Raimi could do with a camera when he had no money and a lot of imagination. Think about that for a moment. This was 2000, before comic book movies were a sure thing, before Marvel had figured out how to make their characters feel like they belonged in the same world. Spider Man was their most valuable property, and they gave it to a guy whose previous film was about a gunfighter transported to medieval England. The first challenge was finding Peter Parker. The studio wanted someone known, someone who could carry $100 million movie. They talked to Freddie Prinze Jr., to Chris Klein, to a dozen young actors who looked like they'd stepped out of a magazine. Raimi wanted someone who actually seemed like they'd been picked on in high school, someone who looked like they'd spent more time reading than working out. He found Tobey Maguire doing a small movie called The Cider House Rules, playing a character who was quiet and observant and had a quality of watchful intelligence that most young actors couldn't manage. Maguire was 25, but could pass for 17. He had big eyes and a soft voice, and something about him that suggested he'd been underestimated his entire life. The screen test was simple. Maguire in a makeshift costume, hanging from a wire in front of a blue screen, delivering the line about great power and great responsibility. But what sold Raimi wasn't the line reading. It was what Maguire did in the moments before and after he spoke. The way he held his body like he wasn't quite comfortable in his own skin yet. The way he looked at the camera like he was seeing something far away. He understood that Spider-Man's real superpower wasn't web-slinging or wall crawling. It was the ability to carry guilt and keep going anyway. They built the movie around that understanding, not around action sequences or special effects, though there would be plenty of both, but around the idea that becoming a hero is actually a form of prolonged adolescence. You get power you don't know how to use, responsibility you don't want, and a costume that makes you feel both more and less like yourself. The spider bite happens 20 minutes into the film, but the real transformation takes the entire movie. Peter Parker doesn't become Spider Man when he gets his powers. He becomes Spider Man when he chooses to use them for something other than himself. Willem Dafoe understood this too. His Norman Osborn wasn't just crazy, wasn't just evil. He was a man who'd gotten everything he thought he wanted and discovered it wasn't enough. Rich, successful, respected, and still hungry for something he couldn't name. The Green Goblin wasn't a monster. He was what Peter Parker might become if he decided that power was more important than responsibility. Every scene between them was really about that choice, about the moment when you decide what kind of person your abilities are going to make you. The movie came out in May 2002, and it changed everything, not just for Marvel, not just for comic book films, but for the entire idea of what a summer blockbuster could be. It made more money in its opening weekend than any film in history to that point. But more than that, it proved that audiences were hungry for heroes who felt human, who struggled with ordinary problems even after they'd gained extraordinary abilities. Spider Man worked because Peter Parker worked, and Peter Parker worked because Tobey Maguire and Sam Raimi understood that the most interesting thing about having superpowers would be how they complicated your regular life instead of simplifying it. The success meant a sequel was inevitable, and this time they had a bigger budget, more confidence, and the luxury of not having to explain who Spider Man was. Spider Man 2 could assume you already cared about Peter Parker and jump straight into the harder question of what it costs to be a hero when being a hero means you can't have anything else. The movie opens with Peter failing at everything except web slinging. He's late for work, behind on rent, failing his classes, and losing the girl he loves because he can't tell her why he's never available when she needs him. His powers are even starting to glitch, cutting out at the worst possible moments because the stress of living two lives is literally breaking down his ability to be Spider Man. Dr. Otto Octavius enters the story as everything Peter Parker wishes he could be: brilliant, respected, married to someone who loves and supports his work, pursuing science that might actually help people. Alfred Molina played him as a man who'd found the balance that Peter can't seem to manage, someone who'd figured out how to be extraordinary without sacrificing his humanity. Then the accident happens, and the mechanical arms fuse with his spine, and suddenly he's trapped in the same prison that Peter built for himself. The arms don't just give him power, they take away his ability to choose how to use it. The train sequence in the middle of the film is still one of the best action scenes I ever put on screen, but what makes it work isn't the spectacle. It's what happens after Spider Man stops the train and collapses, exhausted, his mask torn away. The passengers see his face, see that he's just a kid, really, and instead of exposing him, they protect him. They pass his unconscious body overhead like he's crowd surfing at a concert, and when he wakes up, one of them hands him back his mask and says, "We won't tell nobody, mister." It's a perfect moment, the kind that reminds you why people fall in love with this character. Spider Man saves people, but sometimes people save Spider Man back. The third film had different problems. Sony wanted Venom, Raimi wanted the Sandman, and somewhere in the middle of those competing visions, Spider Man 3 became a movie about too much of everything. Too many villains, too many plot lines, too many dance numbers and jazz clubs. The symbiote storyline should have been simple: an alien costume that makes Peter stronger but also makes him worse, until he has to choose between power and the person he wants to be. Instead, it became a movie where Peter Parker gets an emo haircut and starts acting like he's auditioning for a boy band. The tragedy is that underneath all the studio interference and pacing problems, there was still a good Spider Man story trying to get out. Thomas Hayden Church brought real pathos to Flint Marko, a man whose daughter is dying and who just wants enough money to save her. The movie works when it focuses on forgiveness, on Peter learning that revenge doesn't actually make anything better. But those moments get lost in the noise of everything else the film is trying to do. Topher Grace was miscast as Eddie Brock. The symbiote looked like black silly putty, and the final battle turned into a CGI mess where you couldn't tell who was fighting whom or why you should care. The film made money, but it left a bad taste that effectively ended Raimi's involvement with the character. Sometimes, the most interesting thing about a failure is what it teaches you about why the successes worked. Sony decided to start over. Mark Webb came from indie films and music videos, and his approach to Spider Man was different from Raimi's in ways that mattered. Where Raimi's films were earnest and operatic, Webb wanted something more naturalistic, more grounded in the rhythms of actual teenage conversation. Andrew Garfield brought a different energy to Peter Parker, more sarcastic and confident, less of the everyman underdog that Maguire had embodied. The Amazing Spider Man in 2012 had the unenviable task of retelling an origin story that everyone already knew, barely 10 years after Raimi had told it the first time. Webb tried to differentiate his version by making it a mystery story, with Peter investigating his father's disappearance and discovering that his spider bite wasn't random after all. The film works better than it has any right to, mostly because Garfield and Emma Stone had genuine chemistry as Peter and Gwen Stacy. Their relationship felt like actual teenagers talking to each other instead of actors delivering exposition disguised as banter. But the movie also suffered from feeling unnecessary. The lizard looked like something out of a video game. The conspiracy plot was confusing without being compelling, and the whole thing had the vague sense of being a corporate product designed by committee to hit certain demographic targets. The sequel doubled down on the corporate conspiracy angle and somehow made it even less interesting. The Amazing Spider Man 2 is a film that exists primarily to set up future films that would never get made. Sony wanted their own cinematic universe, their own version of what Marvel was building, and they tried to cram 3 movies worth of setup into one overstuffed story about Electro and the Green Goblin and the Sinister Six and Oscorp's secret experiments and Peter's parents and Gwen's graduation speech. Jamie Foxx deserved better than playing a villain whose motivation was that Spider-Man forgot his name. Dane DeHaan brought an interesting neurotic energy to Harry Osborn, but his transformation into the Green Goblin felt rushed and arbitrary. The movie's best moments were still the quiet ones between Peter and Gwen, conversations about futures and choices and what happens when the person you love is determined to put themselves in danger for strangers. Emma Stone brought intelligence and agency to Gwen Stacy that made her more than just a love interest waiting to be rescued or refrigerated. When she dies at the end, falling through the clock tower while Peter tries desperately to catch her with his web, it genuinely hurts because the film had made you believe in their relationship. Her death wasn't just a plot point, it was the loss of a future they'd been planning together. The failure of The Amazing Spider Man 2 led to something unprecedented in superhero filmmaking. Sony made a deal with Marvel Studios to share the character, allowing Spider Man to appear in the Marvel Cinematic Universe, while Sony retained the film rights. It was a corporate compromise that somehow resulted in the best big screen version of the character since Spider Man 2. Tom Holland's Peter Parker first appeared in Captain America, Civil War, recruited by Tony Stark to help fight other superheroes in what was essentially a very expensive family argument. Holland brought a genuine teenage energy to the role, all nervous chatter and desperate eagerness to prove himself worthy of standing alongside the Avengers. His Spider-Man was younger than the previous versions, still in high school, still living with his aunt, still figuring out how his powers worked and what his responsibilities were. The Civil War appearance was brief but effective, establishing Peter as someone who was brilliant and brave, but also fundamentally out of his depth when dealing with adult superhero politics. Spider Man Homecoming in 2017 was the first Spider Man film to skip the origin story entirely. No radioactive spider bite, no Uncle Ben death scene, no learning that with great power comes great responsibility. The movie assumed you already knew all that and jumped straight into the more interesting question of what happens next. This Peter Parker already had his powers, already had his suit, already knew he wanted to be a hero. The conflict was about learning how to be a hero responsibly, how to help people without making things worse, how to earn the trust of mentors and teammates who had good reasons to think he wasn't ready yet. Michael Keaton's Adrian Toomes was the best Spider Man villain since Dr. Octopus, a working class guy who turned to crime, not because he was evil, but because the system had failed him. The twist that he was also Liz's father, that Peter had unknowingly been dating the daughter of the man he was trying to stop, was the kind of personal complication that made Spider Man stories work. The movie understood that the best superhero conflicts are always personal, always about relationships and choices, rather than just good guys punching bad guys. That understanding would be tested in the films that followed, as Spider Man became increasingly integrated into the larger Marvel Universe, and the intimate street level problems that had always defined the character got swept up in cosmic storylines about Infinity Stones and universal threats. But for one movie, at least, Spider Man got to be Spider Man again. Small scale, personal stakes, a teenager learning how to do the right thing, even when the right thing was complicated or costly or required him to give up something he wanted. Sometimes the simplest stories are the hardest ones to tell. Spider Man Far From Home arrived in 2019 carrying the weight of Avengers, Endgame on its shoulders, tasked with showing us what the Marvel Universe looked like after half the population had been snapped out of existence and then brought back 5 years later. The movie called this event the Blip, a name that somehow made the most traumatic event in human history sound like a minor technical glitch. Peter Parker was dealing with the same thing everyone else was dealing with, which was trying to figure out how to live in a world that had moved on without them. He'd been gone for 5 years, but hadn't aged a day, coming back to find that some of his classmates were now adults, while others were still his age. That his aunt had a new boyfriend, that the world expected him to step up and fill the void left by Tony Stark's death. The movie was about grief, really, though it disguised itself as a summer vacation adventure. Peter didn't want to be the next Iron Man. He wanted to go to Europe with his friends and tell MJ how he felt about her, and maybe kiss her on a bridge somewhere romantic, normal teenage things. But the world kept insisting that normal wasn't an option anymore, that he had responsibilities that went beyond his personal happiness. Jake Gyllenhaal's Mysterio was perfectly cast for this particular moment, a character who understood exactly what Peter wanted to hear and said it with complete conviction. Mysterio told Peter that he could step back, that someone else would handle the big cosmic threats, that he deserved to be a kid for a while longer. It was a seductive lie because it contained enough truth to be believable. Peter did deserve to be a kid. He had been forced to grow up too fast, to take on burdens that would have crushed most adults. The tragedy was that wanting something reasonable didn't make it possible. The world needed Spider Man, whether Peter Parker was ready for that responsibility or not. The revelation that Mysterio was actually a disgruntled former Stark Industries employee using advanced holographic technology to create fake threats he could publicly defeat was the kind of twist that worked on multiple levels. On the surface level, it was a solid superhero plot about deception and manipulation. On a deeper level, it was about how grief makes us vulnerable to people who promise easy answers to complicated problems. Peter wanted so badly to believe that he could step back, that someone else would take care of everything, that he ignored obvious warning signs and handed over technology that could reshape reality itself. The movie's best sequence was probably the one where Mysterio trapped Peter in a series of increasingly surreal illusions, each one designed to break down his sense of what was real and what wasn't. It was visually spectacular, but also psychologically brutal, showing us a young man who was already struggling with impossible expectations being systematically dismantled by someone who understood his weaknesses perfectly. When Peter finally broke free and defeated Mysterio, it felt earned because he'd had to confront not just an external enemy, but his own desire to avoid responsibility. The movie ended with a mid credits sequence that changed everything, revealing Peter's secret identity to the world and framing him for Mysterio's death. J.K. Simmons returned as J. Jonah Jameson, older and angrier, and now running what was clearly meant to be a right wing conspiracy website instead of a newspaper. The sequence was played for shock value, but the implications were genuinely disturbing. Peter Parker had always been the everyman superhero, the one who lived in the same world as his audience, who had to worry about rent and homework and whether his costume would hold up in the wash. Making him a global celebrity fundamentally changed that dynamic. He couldn't be the friendly neighborhood Spider Man anymore because everyone knew who he was and where he lived. Spider Man No Way Home in 2021 was the movie that had to deal with those consequences, and it chose to do so by breaking the multiverse open and bringing back every previous Spider Man villain who had ever learned Peter Parker's secret identity. Willem Dafoe's Green Goblin, Alfred Molina's Dr. Octopus, Thomas Hayden Church's Sandman, Rhys Ifans' Lizard, and Jamie Foxx's Electro all returned, pulled from their respective universes into the MCU by a botched spell that was meant to make people forget that Peter Parker was Spider Man. The concept was ambitious, bordering on insane, a movie that required audiences to have emotional investment in characters and storylines from films that were decades old. Somehow, it worked. The returning villains weren't just nostalgic cameos, but integral parts of a story about second chances and the possibility of redemption. Peter's decision to try to cure the villains rather than simply send them back to their home dimensions to die was the most Spider Man thing any Spider Man had ever done in any movie. It was naive and dangerous, and almost certainly doomed to failure, but it was also fundamentally hopeful in a way that superhero movies rarely allowed themselves to be anymore. The return of Tobey Maguire and Andrew Garfield as alternate versions of Spider Man was handled with surprising restraint, considering how easy it would have been to turn their appearances into pure fan service. Instead, the movie used them to explore different approaches to being Spider Man, different ways of handling loss and responsibility and the weight of being a hero. Maguire's Spider Man was older and more experienced, someone who had learned to find balance between his superhero duties and his personal life. Garfield's Spider Man was still carrying the guilt over Gwen Stacy's death, still struggling with the question of whether he was helping people or just making things worse. Together, the three Spider-Men represented different stages of the same journey, different ways of processing the central Spider Man dilemma of how to use power responsibly. The movie's emotional climax came when Garfield's Spider Man saved MJ from falling, getting the chance to save someone he couldn't save in his own universe. It was a moment of pure catharsis, years of guilt and regret finally finding some kind of resolution. The movie ended with Peter making the ultimate sacrifice, asking Doctor Strange to cast a spell that would make everyone in the world forget that Peter Parker existed. Not just forget that he was Spider Man, but forget Peter Parker entirely. It was a devastating conclusion that returned the character to his roots while also acknowledging everything he'd lost along the way. The final scenes showed Peter starting over completely, living in a tiny apartment, making his own costume, operating without the support system of friends and mentors, and advanced technology that had defined his MCU journey. He was back to being the friendly neighborhood Spider Man, but the cost of getting there had been enormous. He'd given up his relationships, his connections, his entire life as Peter Parker. In some ways, it was the most Spider Man ending possible. The character had always been defined by sacrifice, by choosing to do the right thing, even when it cost him everything he cared about. No Way Home just made that sacrifice literal and complete. The movie was also a meditation on legacy and continuity, on how stories and characters persist across different versions and interpretations. Each Spider Man brought something different to the table, but they were all recognizably the same character at heart. They all understood loss, all carried guilt, all struggled with the balance between personal happiness and heroic responsibility. The multiverse concept could have been a gimmick, but instead it became a way of exploring what made Spider Man essential, what elements of the character remained constant across different actors and different approaches and different decades. That's rare in superhero movies, that kind of genuine respect for the source material and its themes. There's more coming. There's always more coming. Sony is developing multiple Spider Man related projects, exploring different corners of the Spider Verse, bringing back characters and concepts from across the character's long history. But tonight, we've covered the journey from Tobey Maguire's first awkward web swing to Tom Holland's ultimate sacrifice, from a simple story about a teenager learning to use his powers responsibly to a complex meditation on identity and memory and what it means to be a hero in a world that doesn't always deserve saving. That is enough for tonight. There's plenty more where that came from. Sleep well. The story doesn't end there, of course. Spider Man has never been a character who stays down for long, and the cinematic universe has never been willing to let him rest. While we were processing the emotional weight of No Way Home, Sony had already been building something else entirely, something that existed in the spaces between the live action films we'd been following. They called it Spider Man, Into the Spider Verse, and it arrived in 2018 like a lightning bolt, redefining what animation could do and what a Spider Man story could be. Into the Spider Verse wasn't trying to compete with the live action films or replace them. It was doing something completely different, something that felt both revolutionary and inevitable once you saw it. The movie introduced us to Miles Morales, a teenager from Brooklyn who gets bitten by a radioactive spider in a world where Spider Man already exists. But this wasn't just another origin story. The film used the multiverse concept not as a gimmick for bringing back familiar faces, but as a way of exploring identity and belonging and what it means to step into a role that someone else has already defined. Miles wasn't Peter Parker. He was Afro Latino. He was younger, he came from a different background, and had different relationships and different fears. The movie respected those differences while also showing how he could embody the same essential Spider Man qualities: responsibility, sacrifice, using your power to help others, even when it's difficult or dangerous or thankless. The animation style was revolutionary, combining computer animation with comic book aesthetics in ways that made every frame look like a living, breathing comic book page. It was kinetic and colorful and stylized, but it never felt like style for its own sake. Every visual choice served the story and the characters. The multiverse elements brought in other Spider People from different dimensions and different genres. Spider Man Noir from a black and white detective universe, Spider Ham, a cartoon pig version of the character, Penny Parker, an anime influenced Spider Girl who piloted a mechanical suit, Spider Woman, or Spider Gwen, from a universe where Gwen Stacy had been bitten by the spider instead of Peter Parker. Each character came from their own distinct visual and narrative universe, but they all shared the core Spider Man DNA. The movie was a celebration of the characters' versatility, showing how the basic concept could be adapted and reinterpreted across different mediums and different cultural contexts while still remaining recognizably Spider Man. Think about that for a moment. Here was a movie that managed to be both deeply personal and wildly experimental, both respectful of tradition and boldly innovative. It won the Academy Award for Best Animated Feature, beating out established studios and familiar franchises. It proved that audiences were hungry for something different, something that pushed boundaries and took risks while still delivering the emotional core that made Spider Man stories work. The success of Into the Spider-Verse led to Spider Man, Across the Spider-Verse in 2023, which somehow managed to be even more ambitious than its predecessor. This was the first part of a two-part story that expanded the multiverse concept to include hundreds of different spider people from hundreds of different dimensions. The animation was even more experimental, with each universe having its own distinct visual style and aesthetic. Miles found himself traveling between dimensions that looked like watercolor paintings, live action photography, Lego constructions, and abstract art pieces. It was overwhelming in the best possible way, a feast for the eyes that never forgot to ground itself in character and emotion. The story dealt with Miles trying to save his father from a predetermined fate, challenging the idea that certain tragic events are necessary parts of the Spider Man story. He came into conflict with Miguel O'Hara, Spider Man 2099, who led a society of spider people dedicated to maintaining the integrity of the multiverse. Miguel believed that certain events, including the death of a police captain close to each spider person, were canon events that couldn't be prevented without destroying entire universes. Miles refused to accept this, arguing that Spider Man was supposed to save everyone, not accept that some people had to die for the greater good. It was a sophisticated philosophical debate, wrapped in spectacular action sequences and stunning visual storytelling. The movie questioned whether destiny was fixed or changeable, whether heroism meant accepting sacrifice or fighting against it, whether the multiverse was a prison of predetermined stories or a canvas of infinite possibility. These weren't simple questions with easy answers, and the movie didn't pretend they were. The film ended on a cliffhanger, with Miles stranded in the wrong dimension and Gwen assembling a team to help him. Spider Man. Beyond the Spider Verse, the concluding chapter was delayed from its original release date, but the anticipation only built as audiences waited to see how this complex story would resolve itself. Meanwhile, back in the live action world, Sony continued developing their Spider Man universe without Spider Man. Venom had been successful enough to warrant a sequel, Venom, Let There Be Carnage, in 2021. The second film leaned even harder into the odd couple comedy dynamic between Eddie Brock and his symbiote, while introducing the villain Carnage and exploring the relationship between different symbiotes. It was louder and more chaotic than the first film, but it maintained the strange charm that had made Venom work, despite its obvious flaws. The movie's post-credits scene showed Eddie and Venom being transported into the MCU, setting up their appearance in No Way Home's post-credits scene, which then sent them back to their own universe while leaving a piece of the Venom symbiote behind in the MCU. It was a complex bit of multiverse management that suggested Sony and Marvel were finding ways to share the character without fully integrating their separate universes. Sony also released Morbius in 2022, a film about the vampire like anti hero that struggled to find its identity or its audience. The movie featured references to both Venom and Spider Man, suggesting a shared universe, but it never quite figured out what tone it wanted to strike or what story it wanted to tell. It became something of a cultural phenomenon for all the wrong reasons, spawning memes and ironic appreciation that probably wasn't what Sony had intended. But the real surprise was Spider Man, No Way Home's lasting impact on the broader Spider Man narrative. The film had brought together three different versions of the character and their respective supporting casts and villains, creating a sense of continuity and connection across different film series and different decades. It suggested that all Spider Man stories were part of a larger tapestry, that each interpretation and adaptation contributed to a greater understanding of who the character was and what he represented. And this idea of interconnected Spider Man stories across different mediums and different universes became central to how people thought about the character. The comics had always featured multiple spider people, but now the movies and animated series were embracing that same multiplicity. There wasn't just one definitive Spider Man anymore. There was Miles, and Peter, and Gwen, and Miguel, and dozens of others, each bringing their own perspective and their own strengths to the role. That multiplicity felt appropriate for a character who had always been about relatability and accessibility. Spider Man worked because he felt like someone you might know, someone who struggled with the same kinds of problems you faced in your own life. Having multiple spider people from different backgrounds and different circumstances expanded that relatability rather than diluting it. There was room for everyone under the Spider Man umbrella, room for different stories and different approaches and different ways of exploring what it meant to have power and responsibility. The animated films had proven that Spider Man stories could push boundaries and take risks while still honoring the character's essential qualities. The live action films had shown how the character could evolve and grow across different interpretations while maintaining his core appeal. Together, they created a sense that Spider Man was bigger than any single version or adaptation, that he belonged to everyone who had ever felt like an outsider, or struggled with doing the right thing, or wondered whether they were strong enough to help the people they cared about. There's something peaceful about that idea, something comforting about the notion that these stories will continue, that there will always be new spider people swinging through new versions of New York, facing new challenges and learning the same essential lessons about power and responsibility. The details change, the faces change, the animation styles and the special effects and the cultural context change, but the heart remains constant. That continuity feels especially important in a world that often seems chaotic and unpredictable. Spider Man stories offer a kind of moral clarity, a reminder that individuals can make a difference, that choosing to help others is always worthwhile, even when it's difficult or thankless or comes at great personal cost. These aren't naive stories or simple stories, but they are fundamentally hopeful stories, and that hope feels valuable and necessary. The future promises more Spider Man stories across more formats and more universes. There will be new animated films and new live action appearances and new interpretations of familiar themes. Some will be better than others, some will take risks that pay off, and others will try things that don't quite work, but they'll all be part of this larger ongoing conversation about heroism and responsibility and what it means to use whatever power you have to make the world a little bit better. That conversation has been going on for more than 60 years now, across comics and movies and television shows and video games and every other medium that can tell stories. It shows no signs of stopping, and that feels exactly right. There's always another web to swing on, always another person who needs help, always another story worth telling. That is enough for tonight. There's plenty more where that came from. Sleep well. But before we close the book entirely on this particular journey through Spider Man's cinematic history, there are a few quieter moments worth dwelling on, small details that reveal something deeper about why these stories have endured and why they continue to resonate with audiences across different generations and cultures. Think about the way Tobey Maguire's Peter Parker looks at his hands after being bitten by that radioactive spider, the confusion and wonder and slight fear in his expression as he realizes that his body is changing in ways he doesn't understand. There's no dialogue in that moment, just a young man trying to process something impossible, and it captures perfectly the disorientation of adolescence, the way growing up often feels like becoming someone you don't recognize. Or consider the moment in Spider Man 2 when Peter loses his powers temporarily and walks down the street as an ordinary person, and you can see in his posture and his gait how much lighter he feels without the weight of responsibility on his shoulders. It's a brief respite, but it's also profoundly sad because we understand that this normalcy he craves comes at the cost of his ability to help people who need him. Andrew Garfield's Spider Man gave us different kinds of quiet moments, like the scene where he sits with Gwen Stacy on the fire escape and they just talk, no superhero business intruding, just two young people figuring out how to be together despite the complications in their lives. There's something achingly real about those conversations, the way they stumble over words and laugh at their own awkwardness and try to navigate the space between what they want and what they think they should want. Garfield brought a nervous energy to Peter Parker that felt very contemporary, a kind of anxious intelligence that many viewers recognized in themselves or in people they knew. His Spider Man was more openly emotional than Maguire's, more willing to show vulnerability and uncertainty, and that openness created its own kind of connection with audiences who appreciated seeing a superhero who didn't always have everything figured out. Tom Holland's contribution to this legacy includes moments of surprising maturity, like the scene in Spider Man Homecoming, where he's trapped under rubble and has to find the strength to lift himself out, not through some surge of superpowers, but through sheer determination and the realization that no one else is coming to save him. It's a moment that works as both literal action and metaphor for growing up, for learning that sometimes you have to save yourself before you can save anyone else. Holland's Peter Parker is younger than his predecessors when we first meet him, but his arc across multiple films shows him gradually learning the same lessons about power and responsibility, just in a different context and with different stakes. The animated films offer their own collection of meaningful, small moments, like the way Miles Morales moves when he's first learning to control his spider powers, all awkward angles and unexpected momentum, capturing both the physical comedy and the genuine difficulty of mastering abilities you never asked for. Spider Verse understood that becoming a hero isn't just about gaining powers, it's about learning to trust yourself and finding the courage to act even when you're not sure you're ready. The film's visual style reinforced this theme by making Miles's world literally more colorful and dynamic as he grew into his role as Spider-Man, showing character development through artistic technique in ways that felt innovative and emotionally resonant. What strikes me about all these different interpretations is how they each found ways to make the familiar story feel fresh and personal while still honoring the core themes that make Spider Man stories meaningful. The best moments in these films aren't the big action sequences or the spectacular special effects, though those certainly have their place. The best moments are the quiet ones, where we see these characters as people first and superheroes second, where we understand their fears and hopes and the weight of the choices they have to make. These moments work because they tap into something universal about the experience of trying to do right by the people you care about, even when doing right is complicated or costly or doesn't come with any guarantee of success. The recurring theme across all these films is the idea that being a hero isn't about having perfect powers or perfect judgment. It's about showing up and trying to help even when you're scared or uncertain or dealing with your own problems. Every version of Spider Man has moments of doubt, moments where the responsibility feels too heavy or the cost too high, but they all ultimately choose to keep going because they understand that their ability to help creates an obligation to help. That's a heavy theme for what are often marketed as light entertainment, but it's handled with enough nuance and humanity that it never feels preachy or simplistic. The films also share an understanding that heroism is often lonely and thankless work. Spider Man rarely gets the recognition that other superheroes receive, and his dual identity means he can't even share the burden with the people closest to him. This isolation is part of what makes the character compelling, but it's also part of what makes his choice to continue being Spider Man so meaningful. He doesn't do it for glory or gratitude. He does it because it needs to be done, and he has the ability to do it. That kind of quiet heroism feels especially relevant in a world where so many problems require sustained effort from people who may never see the full results of their work. Looking back across more than 2 decades of Spider Man films, what emerges is a portrait of heroism that is both inspiring and realistic, both extraordinary and deeply human. These stories remind us that the most important battles are often fought not against cosmic threats or supervillains, but against our own doubts and fears and the temptation to look the other way when someone needs help. They suggest that the power to make a difference doesn't require superhuman abilities, just the willingness to act when action is needed and to keep trying, even when success isn't guaranteed. That's the real legacy of these films, not the box office numbers or the special effects or the way they've influenced other superhero movies, but the way they've kept alive this particular vision of what it means to be heroic in everyday life. They've shown us Spider Man swinging through different versions of New York, facing different challenges and learning the same essential lessons, And in doing so, they've created a kind of ongoing meditation on responsibility and power and the choices we make when we think no one is watching. There will be more Spider Man stories, more interpretations, and more attempts to capture what makes this character endure across different media and different generations. Some will succeed brilliantly, others will fall short, but they'll all be part of this larger conversation about what it means to use whatever abilities so you have in service of something larger than yourself. That conversation feels more important now than ever, and these films have helped keep it alive and vibrant and accessible to new audiences who are just discovering what it means to have great power and great responsibility. The web continues to be spun, the story continues to be told, and somewhere in New York, real or imagined, Spider Man is still swinging through the night, still watching out for the people who can't watch out for themselves. That constancy is reassuring, a reminder that some stories are too important to end, too necessary to abandon, too fundamentally human to ever truly go out of style. Sleep well. It's quite late now, deep into the quiet hours when the city finally exhales, and you found your way here into the soft glow of this screen. The kind of hour when thoughts can drift, untethered, across familiar landscapes, or when the details of stories we've known for years can take on a new, softer texture. We're going to talk about a man who didn't choose his path through a burst of ambition, or a calculated strategic move, or even a moment of divine inspiration. He chose it because of a quiet, relentless pressure, a weight settling on his shoulders that was entirely internal, a sense of having to be better, to prove something, not to the world, but to himself. We're talking about Bruce Wayne and the long, winding path he took to become the Batman. It wasn't a sudden metamorphosis, it was a slow, deliberate carving away of a life, until only the essential structure remained. We'll trace that journey through the films, from his earliest cinematic appearances to the most recent, exploring the choices made, the interpretations offered, and the enduring core that remains. We'll get there without any particular rush. This isn't a countdown or a definitive ranking. It's more of a meandering exploration, a quiet walk through the shadows of Gotham. If you find this kind of quiet reflection helpful, if it settles the mind a little, you might consider subscribing. No pressure, it'll still be here. So let's begin, not with a roar, but with a whisper, back in the simpler, brighter days of 1966. The first major cinematic appearance of Batman, outside of serials, was in the 1966 film, a direct continuation of the immensely popular television series starring Adam West and Burt Ward. This was a Batman of a different era, a distinctly pop art creation, vibrant and camp, where the colors were bright and the sound effects were printed on screen. Here, Bruce Wayne wasn't a brooding figure. He was a charming, slightly eccentric millionaire, always polite, always composed, even when explaining how to properly dispose of a bomb. The film saw him and Robin facing off against a truly all-star lineup of villains: the Joker, the Penguin, the Riddler, and Catwoman, all working together in a plot to dehydrate world leaders. Think about that for a moment. Dehydrating world leaders. It's absurd, and it's meant to be. The film fully embraced its comedic tone, presenting a superhero who was often perplexed by the sheer evil he encountered, but never truly daunted. Adam West's portrayal was iconic precisely because he played it completely straight, delivering lines about shark-repellent bat spray with absolute conviction. The underlying message, however, was still there, beneath the surface of the bright costumes and cartoonish violence. Batman was a force for order, for justice, even if that justice involved oversized rubber sharks. This film established Batman as a cultural phenomenon, a recognizable figure even to those who knew nothing of his comic book origins. But it was a very specific, while lighthearted interpretation that would eventually be challenged and reinterpreted. It was a foundation, but one that many would build upon, and often against. Decades passed before a new vision of Batman emerged on the silver screen, a vision much closer to the darker, more complex character that had begun to take shape in the comics of the late 70s and 80s. This brings us to 1989 and Tim Burton's Batman. This film was a stark contrast to its predecessor, a gothic, brooding affair that reimagined Gotham City as a nightmare metropolis, a place where Art Deco met industrial grime. Michael Keaton, an unexpected choice for the role, brought a quiet intensity to Bruce Wayne. His Batman was less about outward showmanship and more about internal torment. The film opens with a powerful introduction to his methodology. He's a myth, a creature of the night, inspiring fear in criminals long before he even appears. The central conflict here, of course, was with Jack Nicholson's Joker, a performance that truly dominated the screen. Nicholson's Joker was a grotesque artist, a criminal whose motivations were as much about chaos and twisted beauty as they were about power. The film delved, albeit briefly, into their shared history, hinting at the Joker's role in the death of Bruce's parents, a controversial choice at the time, but one that cemented a deep personal vendetta between them. This Batman was still a hero, still driven by justice, but his methods were rougher, his demeanor more solitary. He was a creature of the shadows, and Gotham felt like a city that truly needed him, not as a symbol of hope, but as a necessary evil to combat an even greater one. The film was a massive success, proving that a darker, more serious take on superheroes could resonate with a wide audience. It reshaped the public perception of Batman, pulling him from the realm of camp and into something more akin to a tragic figure. Then, just 3 years later, in 1992, Burton returned with Batman Returns. This film pushed the Gothic aesthetic even further, creating a darker, more operatic vision of Gotham. Michael Keaton's Batman was even more withdrawn, more isolated. The film explored his loneliness, his inability to connect with others, perhaps because his true self, his masked self, was the only one he felt truly comfortable in. This time, he faced off against two equally damaged villains: Danny DeVito's Penguin, a grotesque outcast seeking acceptance and revenge, and Michelle Pfeiffer's Catwoman, a woman resurrected and transformed by trauma, embodying a kind of chaotic feminine energy that both attracted and repelled Bruce. The relationships in this film were complex and fraught. The dynamic between Batman and Catwoman was particularly compelling. Two lost souls recognizing something of themselves in the other, a shared brokenness that made their antagonism feel like a twisted form of intimacy. The film's themes were darker, exploring questions of identity, societal rejection, and the blurred lines between hero and villain. It was a more personal story for Bruce Wayne, one where his internal struggles were as prominent as the external threats. Batman Returns cemented Burton's distinctive vision, but its intensities and dark themes also began to push against the boundaries of what a mainstream superhero film was expected to be. It was a powerful, if somewhat unsettling, exploration of the character, leaving a distinct mark. The cinematic journey of Batman took a sharp turn with Joel Schumacher's Batman Forever in 1995. This film, and its successor, represented a conscious effort to lighten the tone, to return to a more vibrant, if still stylized, aesthetic. Val Kilmer stepped into the cowl, portraying a Bruce Wayne who was perhaps a little more outwardly charming, but still wrestling with his inner demons. The film introduced Robin, played by Chris O'Donnell, a character whose personal tragedy mirrored Bruce's own, offering a new dynamic to the solitary hero. The villains were Jim Carrey's Riddler, a manic, flamboyant genius, and Tommy Lee Jones' Two-Face, a character driven by pure vengeance and duality. Batman Forever was brighter, faster, and more overtly comic book-like than Burton's films. The neon-lit Gotham was a far cry from the grimy Gothic city we had seen before. The film explored Bruce's struggle with his dual identity, his desire for a normal life versus the consuming nature of his mission. Robin's presence forced him to confront his own past and the idea of partnership, of sharing the burden. It was a significant shift in tone, moving away from the psychological depth of the Burton films towards a more action oriented, visually playful approach. It was a commercial success, but it also began to divide audiences, with some missing the previous darkness and others embracing the more colorful spectacle. Then came Batman and Robin in 1997, a film that fully embraced the camp aesthetic of the 1966 series, but without the underlying sincerity. George Clooney took on the role of Batman, portraying him as a charming, almost jovial figure, often delivering one liners. This film was an explosion of primary colors, exaggerated performances, and an abundance of ice puns. It introduced Batgirl, played by Alicia Silverstone, adding another hero to the roster, and featured Arnold Schwarzenegger as Mr. Freeze and Uma Thurman as Poison Ivy. This film pushed the boundaries of excess with its infamous bat nipples, credit card, and the general feeling of a toy commercial masquerading as a movie. The narrative was sprawling, the villains often cartoonish, and the stakes felt oddly low despite the grand schemes. While it aimed for lighthearted fun, it often veered into self-parody. Batman and Robin is often cited as a critical low point for the franchise, effectively putting the cinematic interpretation of Batman on ice for several years. It became a cautionary tale, a demonstration of how far a beloved character could stray from its core essence when chasing a particular trend. The reaction to this film was so strong that it necessitated a re-evaluation of how Batman would be brought to the screen in the future. After a long hiatus, the character was completely reinvented with Christopher Nolan's Batman Begins in 2005. This film took a grounded, realistic approach, aiming to explore the origins of Batman with a psychological depth previously unseen in live action. Christian Bale's portrayal of Bruce Wayne was central to this. He was a man consumed by trauma and guilt, driven by an almost pathological need to understand and conquer fear. The film meticulously detailed his journey, his training with Ra's al Ghul in the League of Shadows, his development of the cowl and gadgets, and his first steps as a vigilante. Nolan's Gotham was a tangible, gritty city, not a stylized fantasy. The focus was on the practicalities of being Batman, the logistics of his operation, and the ethical dilemmas he faced. The villains, Liam Neeson's Ra's al Ghul and Cillian Murphy's Scarecrow, were formidable, but their threats felt real, rooted in the social decay and psychological vulnerabilities of Gotham. This film wasn't just an origin story, it was a deep dive into the making of a hero, exploring the internal and external forces that shaped him. It redefined what a superhero film could be, emphasizing character, theme, and a sense of tangible reality over pure spectacle. It was a powerful new beginning. Then, in 2008, The Dark Knight arrived, building upon the foundations of its predecessor and achieving a level of critical and commercial success that reshaped the entire landscape of superhero cinema. Christian Bale's Batman was now a more experienced, but also more burdened hero. He was a symbol that Gotham had embraced, but one that was constantly pushed to its limits. The film's central conflict was the ideological war between Batman and Heath Ledger's Joker, a performance that was raw, terrifying, and utterly captivating. This Joker was an agent of chaos, with no discernible motive beyond proving that society's order was a fragile illusion. The film delved deep into themes of moral ambiguity, the nature of heroism, and the sacrifices required to maintain order in a chaotic world. It explored the fine line between justice and vigilantism and the corrupting influence of power. Harvey Dent's transformation into Two-Face served as a tragic counterpoint to Batman, showing how even the purest intentions could be twisted by despair. The Dark Knight was not just a superhero movie, it was a crime epic, a psychological thriller, and a profound meditation on the struggle between good and evil. It pushed Batman to his breaking point, forcing him to make impossible choices and sacrifice his own reputation for the greater good. It was a film that resonated far beyond the comic book fandom, becoming a cultural touchstone. The trilogy concluded with The Dark Knight Rises in 2012, set 8 years after the events of The Dark Knight. Bruce Wayne is a recluse, his body broken, his spirit weary, and Batman is a distant memory, having taken the blame for Harvey Dent's crimes. This film explored the consequences of that sacrifice and the possibility of a world without Batman. The arrival of Tom Hardy's Bane, a physically imposing and intellectually cunning terrorist, forces Bruce to return to action, but not before he is completely broken down, both physically and psychologically. The film delves into themes of redemption, legacy, and the cyclical nature of struggle. Selena Kyle, played by Anne Hathaway, offers a complex moral compass, a thief with a sense of street level justice. The story forces Bruce to confront his own mortality and the idea that Batman is more than just one man. It's a symbol that can inspire others, a legacy that can be passed on. The ending, with its suggestion of a new beginning for both Bruce and the mantle of Batman, offered a sense of closure while also hinting at the enduring power of the symbol. The Dark Knight Rises brought a fitting, if somber, end to a groundbreaking trilogy, solidifying Nolan's vision as a definitive cinematic interpretation. Following the Nolan era, Batman was brought into a shared cinematic universe, beginning with Batman v Superman: Dawn of Justice in 2016. Ben Affleck stepped into the role, portraying an older, more jaded, and deeply embittered Bruce Wayne. This Batman was hardened by years of fighting crime, scarred by loss, and disillusioned with humanity, particularly the arrival of an alien godlike figure, Superman. The film explored the paranoia and fear that an all powerful being could instill in a human hero, leading to a brutal and ideologically driven conflict. Affleck's Batman was physically imposing, a brutal fighter who had crossed lines, using lethal force and marking criminals. This was a radical departure from previous interpretations, presenting a Batman who was more vigilante than hero, driven by a deep-seated anger and a desire to dismantle perceived threats before they could materialize, and the film delved into the psychological toll of his long war on crime, depicting a man teetering on the edge of despair. His arc in the film involved a reawakening of his moral compass, a realization that he had become what he fought against, ultimately leading him to form the Justice League. This iteration of Batman was controversial, but it offered a raw, unflinching look at a hero pushed to his limits, a man defined by his trauma and the weight of his mission. Affleck reprised the role in Justice League 2017 and later the director's cut in 2021, where his Batman served as the grizzled veteran, the strategist, and the financier of the newly formed superhero team. Here, his focus shifted from his own personal demons to the larger threat facing the world. He was the one who assembled the disparate heroes, recognizing the need for unity in the face of cosmic danger. His character arc in these films was about moving past his isolation and learning to trust and lead others, a significant evolution from the solitary figure we'd seen before. He was still a dark, imposing presence, but one who was beginning to find a new purpose in collaboration, acknowledging that some threats are too great for even a Batman to face alone. Most recently, Matt Reeves offered a new, distinct vision with the Batman in 2022. Robert Pattinson portrays a younger Bruce Wayne, only 2 years into his career as Batman. This film pulls heavily from noir detective stories, presenting Batman as a true detective, meticulously investigating a series of gruesome crimes orchestrated by Paul Dano's Riddler. This Bruce Wayne is still very much figuring things out. He's withdrawn, socially awkward, and deeply consumed by his mission, sometimes to the detriment of his public persona. This Batman is a creature of the night, raw and brutal in his combat style, but also intellectually driven. The film emphasizes his detective skills, his observational prowess, and his relentless pursuit of truth, even when it's uncomfortable. Gotham is depicted as a perpetually rainy, corrupt, and decaying city, a character in itself. The villains, including Colin Farrell's Penguin and Zoe Kravitz's Catwoman, feel grounded and gritty. This interpretation explores Batman's early days, his struggles with public perception, and his realization that simply inspiring fear isn't enough. He also needs to inspire hope. It's a dark, atmospheric, and character driven film, one that focuses on the psychological toll of his mission and the slow, arduous process of becoming a true symbol of justice. This film demonstrated that there are still new depths to explore within the character, new facets to illuminate, even after decades of cinematic interpretation. Looking back across these varied interpretations, from the campy antics of Adam West to the brooding realism of Christian Bale and the noirish grit of Robert Pattinson, what emerges is a testament to the enduring power and adaptability of the character. Each film, each actor, each director has peeled back a different layer of Bruce Wayne, revealing the fear, the anger, the loneliness, the determination, and ultimately, the unwavering commitment to justice that defines Batman. It's a story about trauma, yes, but also about resilience. It's a story about vengeance, but also about the slow, painful evolution towards something more noble. The core idea that one man, driven by a terrible loss, can dedicate his entire life to protecting others remains constant, even as the tone, style, and focus shift dramatically. These films have shown us Batman as a myth, as a detective, as a broken man, as a leader, and as a symbol. They've explored the cost of his choices, the sacrifices he makes, and the heavy burden he carries. Ultimately, the story of Batman on screen is the story of a man constantly wrestling with himself, with his city, and with the very concept of justice. And that struggle, often fought in the lonely hours of the night, is what continues to resonate. That is enough for tonight. There's plenty more where that came from. Sleep well. It's late now. Well past midnight, I imagine, where you are. The house is quiet. The day's sounds have settled into a soft hum. You're lying there, I hope, comfortable and still, listening to these words drift through the darkness. Tonight, we're going to talk about Spider-Man. Not the webs, not the quips, not the specific supervillains. Not exactly, anyway. We're going to talk about the burden, the sheer crushing weight of responsibility and expectation that has been placed upon Peter Parker in every single cinematic incarnation. It wasn't the radioactive spider bite that made him Spider-Man. It wasn't even Uncle Ben's death. Not truly. It was the moment he understood what it meant to hold power and the specific consequence of failing to wield it responsibly. That's the thread we'll follow. That single, defining moment. We'll trace this particular thread through every major live-action film, from his earliest big screen appearance to his most recent, examining how each version grapples with this central idea. We'll get there without any particular rush. This isn't a countdown or a race. We're just going to explore the quiet corners of this character's journey. If you find yourself drifting off, that's perfectly fine. The story will still be here when you return. So let's begin, not with a beginning, but with a transformation. Our first real cinematic encounter with Peter Parker in Sam Raimi's Spider-Man from 2002 introduces us to a character already steeped in a certain kind of vulnerability. He is, from the outset, an outsider, a brilliant but painfully shy high school student, overshadowed by his athletic best friend, Harry Osborn, and hopelessly in love with the girl next door, Mary Jane Watson, who seems perpetually out of his reach. The world around him feels designed to make him feel small. Then comes the spider. It's a moment of pure fantastical chance, almost accidental in its profound consequence. The bite itself is uncomfortable, a shift in his biology that manifests not as immediate power, but as a fever, a struggle. He wakes up changed, yes, but not instantly heroic. His initial response to these burgeoning abilities is a very human one, self-interest. He tests his strength, He practices his agility. He even considers using them for personal gain. This is crucial. He isn't born a hero. He becomes one through a very specific failure. That failure arrives in the form of a wrestling match. He needs money and sees an opportunity. He acts impulsively, neglects a duty, and then, in a moment of frustrated pettiness, allows a thief to escape. Think about that for a moment. He allows it. It's not an oversight, it's a conscious turning away. Minutes later, that same thief murders his Uncle Ben. The weight of this consequence is immediate and devastating. With great power comes great responsibility. The line is not just an adage, it's a brand, it's a burden, it's the origin of his guilt, the fuel for his mission. It's everything. From this point, the film shifts. Peter's journey is no longer about discovering his powers, but about atoning for his failure. His early fights as Spider Man are driven by a raw, almost vengeful energy. He's learning on the job, making mistakes, but always pushing forward because the alternative is to drown in his own remorse. His interactions with Mary Jane, his struggles with Harry, his quiet life with Aunt May, these are all colored by the secret he carries, the knowledge that he could have prevented a tragedy. The Green Goblin, Norman Osborn, serves as a dark mirror to Peter's own burgeoning power, a man corrupted by it, lacking the moral compass that Peter is so desperately trying to forge. By the end of this first film, Peter has embraced his role, but it's a heavy embrace. He has chosen the path of sacrifice, of putting others before himself, because he knows, intimately, the cost of not doing so. It's a foundation built on grief and a profound sense of duty. The second film, Spider-Man 2 Legs, deepens this exploration of burden. Peter is now 2 years into his life as Spider-Man, and the toll is immense. His personal life is a disaster. He's failing in college, struggling to hold down a job. His friendship with Harry is strained, and Mary Jane is moving on with her life, seemingly without him. He's constantly late, constantly exhausted, constantly making excuses. His powers at times even begin to fail him, a physical manifestation of his emotional and psychological exhaustion. He's trying to be everything to everyone, and he's failing at all of it. This period of his life is about the cost of heroism. It's about the sacrifices he makes, not just for the city, but for the secret identity itself. He can't have a normal life, a normal relationship, a normal future, because the needs of the many always outweigh the needs of the one. This is reinforced by the emergence of Dr. Octopus, Otto Octavius, another brilliant scientist whose own ambition and a tragic accident lead him down a destructive path. He represents the danger of unchecked brilliance, a foil to Peter's struggle with controlled power. The film's most poignant moment comes when Peter, overwhelmed, chooses to give up being Spider-Man. He literally throws his suit into an alley, attempting to reclaim his life. For a brief period, he experiences normalcy. He does better in school, reconnects with Mary Jane, finds a semblance of peace. But the world, as it always does, continues to need Spider-Man. When innocent lives are threatened, when he sees the consequences of his absence, the weight of responsibility pulls him back. He recognizes that, despite the personal pain, he must be Spider-Man. It's not a choice anymore, it's an unavoidable obligation. The climax, with the runaway train, is a powerful reaffirmation of his commitment, a moment where the city witnesses his sacrifice, even if they don't know his name. He accepts the burden, not with joy, but with a quiet, resolute understanding. It's a heavy quiet. By Spider-Man 3 Weeks, the weight of this existence begins to fracture him. The film introduces elements that test Peter's character in new ways. The introduction of the symbiote, a sentient alien entity that bonds with him, literally darkens his personality. It amplifies his anger, his arrogance, and his desire for vengeance, particularly against Flint Marko, who he believes to be Uncle Ben's true killer. This is a crucial distinction. In the first film, his guilt was internalized. Here, it's weaponized. The symbiote allows him to indulge his darker impulses, to become the very thing he fought against, a force driven by retribution rather than responsibility. His personal life continues to unravel. His relationship with Mary Jane is strained by his growing ego and his inability to be truly present for her. His friendship with Harry descends into outright animosity, fueled by Harry's misplaced blame for his father's death. The film explores the idea that even the best intentions can be corrupted, that the line between hero and villain can become blurred when personal pain takes precedence over altruism. The symbiote, in essence, is a physical manifestation of the internal darkness he's always had to fight, the temptation to use his power for selfish reasons. He eventually rejects the symbiote, understanding its corrupting influence, but not before it creates Venom, a monstrous reflection of his own unchecked power. The climax of the film sees Peter and Harry and Venom locked in a struggle that brings all their personal demons to the surface. It is only when Peter truly understands the cycle of vengeance, when he forgives Flint Marko and recognizes his own capacity for darkness, that he can truly overcome these threats. The film is messy, certainly, with its multiple villains and narrative threads, but at its heart is a continuation of Peter's struggle with the immense pressure of being Spider-Man. He learns that the greatest responsibility is not just to fight crime, but to maintain his own moral compass, to resist the seductive pull of anger and revenge. It's a hard lesson, learned through considerable personal loss and public humiliation. Then came the reboot. The Amazing Spider-Man, in 2012, presented a Peter Parker who was in many ways quite different from his predecessor, yet still grappling with the same foundational issues. Andrew Garfield's Peter is a bit more rebellious, a bit more sardonic, a skateboard-riding outcast with a quick wit, but still deeply lonely. The core elements of his origin remain: the radioactive spider, the burgeoning powers, the initial thrill of personal gain, and the profound tragedy of Uncle Ben's death. Here, the death of Uncle Ben is even more directly linked to Peter's hubris. He intentionally allows a thief to escape after a petty argument with a convenience store clerk. This version of Peter is more directly responsible, the inaction more deliberate, making his guilt even more acute. "I could have stopped him," he says with a raw, undeniable pain. This reinforces the central theme. Responsibility isn't just about what you do, but what you fail to do. His early forays as Spider-Man are driven by a quest for vengeance, a hunt for the man who killed his uncle. He's rougher, more experimental with his powers, and less concerned with public perception. His relationship with Gwen Stacy, however, offers a different kind of anchor. She is intelligent, capable, and arguably his intellectual equal, allowing for a partnership dynamic that was less present in the earlier films. The Lizard, Dr. Kurt Connors, serves as a cautionary tale of scientific ambition gone awry, a man who, like Peter, is trying to fix himself but loses control. This iteration emphasizes Peter's intelligence, his capacity for scientific innovation, and his more direct involvement is in creating his web shooters, rather than them being an organic development. He's a tinkerer, a problem solver, but still fundamentally a boy haunted by a single, catastrophic mistake. The film ends with him accepting his role, embracing the responsibility, but with a sense of isolation that is distinctly his own. It's a lonelier hero. The Amazing Spider-Man 2 in 2014 continued this darker trajectory, leaning heavily into the theme of sacrifice and the consequences of Peter's choices. His relationship with Gwen is central here, and the tension between his desire for a normal life and his duties as Spider-Man is palpable. He sees visions of Captain Stacy, Gwen's deceased father, haunting him with the promise he made to keep Gwen safe by staying away from her. This internal conflict is a constant burden, a reminder of the danger he brings to those he loves. The film introduces multiple villains, much like its predecessor's third act, but with a more focused emotional core. Harry Osborn, now estranged and desperate, and Electro, Max Dillon, an overlooked Oscorp employee who gains powers and feels betrayed by Spider Man. These villains, in their own ways, reflect facets of Peter's struggle, Harry's desperation for answers and power, and Electro's feeling of invisibility and resentment. The film explores the idea that Spider Man's actions, however noble, can have unforeseen and tragic consequences. The defining moment of this film, and arguably of this entire iteration, is Gwen Stacy's death. It's a moment of profound, irrecoverable loss, directly attributable to Peter's life as Spider Man. He tries to save her, he uses all his strength, all his ingenuity, but he fails. This isn't a failure of inaction like Uncle Ben. This is a failure despite his best efforts. It's a crushing blow, a demonstration that even with great power and immense responsibility, some things are beyond his control. Her death plunges him into a deep depression, making him question his entire purpose. For a time, he stops being Spider Man. The city suffers. But eventually, he is compelled to return, understanding that giving up would dishonor Gwen's memory. He takes on the burden of her loss, integrating it into his identity. It's a heavy, heavy cost. Then came the Marvel Cinematic Universe, and with it, a younger, brighter, and initially less burdened Peter Parker. Tom Holland's Spider Man was first introduced in Captain America Civil War 2016, a wide eyed, enthusiastic teenager thrilled by the prospect of being a superhero. He's recruited by Tony Stark, given a high tech suit, and thrown into a conflict far beyond his experience. This Peter is not yet weighed down by the full extent of his responsibility. He's still figuring out what his powers even mean. He's a kid, brimming with potential, but also with an almost naive excitement. His great power is being mentored by an Avenger. His great responsibility is still being gently guided by Tony Stark. Spider Man Homecoming 2017 immediately grounds this version of Peter Parker. He's back in high school, longing for the next big adventure, desperate to prove himself to Tony Stark. This film focuses on Peter's journey to understand what it means to be a local hero, a friendly neighborhood Spider Man, rather than an Avenger. His central conflict isn't just with the Vulture, Adrian Toomes, but with his own impatience and his tendency to overreach. Tony Stark acts as a surrogate father figure, continually reminding Peter that he needs to learn to walk before he can fly, and to understand the impact of his actions. The film deliberately downplays the Uncle Ben narrative, acknowledging it implicitly rather than dwelling on the explicit origin. Instead, Peter's primary lesson in responsibility comes from Tony, who takes away his advanced suit after Peter nearly causes a ferry disaster. This is Peter's great power, great responsibility moment for the MCU. He learns that the suit doesn't make the hero. The choices he makes do. He learns to use his inherent abilities, his intelligence, and his moral compass, rather than relying on technology. The film ends with him rejecting an offer to join the Avengers full-time, choosing instead to be the Spider-Man his neighborhood needs. He's still a kid, still making mistakes, but he's beginning to understand the quiet dignity of everyday heroism. It's a more hopeful, but still challenging path. Spider-Man Far From Home 2019 sees Peter grappling with an even greater burden, the legacy of Tony Stark. Following the events of Avengers and Endgame, Peter is now seen as the potential successor to Iron Man, a pressure he desperately tries to avoid. He's grieving, he's overwhelmed, and he yearns for a normal summer vacation. This film explores the responsibility of leadership, the weight of expectation, and the danger of trusting too easily. Mysterio, Quentin Beck, manipulates Peter's grief and his desire to relinquish responsibility, using advanced illusion technology to pose as a hero. Peter, still learning, hands over critical technology, only to realize he's been deceived. This is another pivotal, great power, great responsibility moment. He learns that trust must be earned, that intuition is as important as technology, and that avoiding responsibility only leads to greater problems. By the end, he fully embraces his role, understanding that he cannot escape the call to heroism, even if it means sacrificing his personal desires. The post credits scene, which reveals his secret identity to the world, sets up a whole new level of burden, a public responsibility he has never had to face before. It's a moment designed to strip away his last vestiges of normalcy. And that brings us to Spider Man No Way Home, 2021, a film that brings all these threads together, not just for Tom Holland's Peter, but for every cinematic iteration. When Peter's identity is exposed, his life and the lives of those he loves are irrevocably shattered. He seeks a magical solution from Doctor Strange, a spell that goes horribly wrong, pulling villains and crucially other versions of Spider Man from across the multiverse into his reality. This film is the ultimate exploration of the Spider Man burden. Our Peter, overwhelmed and driven by a desire to fix everything, initially wants to send the villains back to their deaths, but the other Peters, Tobey Maguire and Andrew Garfield, who have lived through their own unique forms of loss and understood the core tenet of responsibility, convince him otherwise. They remind him that with great power comes the responsibility not just to fight, but to save, to heal, to offer second chances, even to those who seem beyond redemption. This is the profound evolution of the great responsibility mantra. It expands beyond simply preventing harm to actively seeking rehabilitation. The film is a masterclass in showing the cumulative weight of Peter Parker's journey. The two older Spider-Men share their wisdom, their pain, and their understanding of the sacrifices required. They've all lost, they've all failed, but they've all kept going. The film culminates in Peter making the ultimate sacrifice, asking Doctor Strange to cast a spell that makes the entire world forget Peter Parker ever existed. He sacrifices his identity, his relationships, his entire personal history to save the multiverse and protect his loved ones. It's a choice of immense selflessness, a complete embrace of the burden, a final understanding that sometimes the greatest good requires the greatest personal cost. He is truly alone now, but he is Spider Man, fully formed, fully understanding the quiet, heavy nature of his duty. He has traded everything for the greater good. Looking back across these films, from Tobey Maguire's accidental hero burdened by immediate guilt, to Andrew Garfield's angsty, vengeful, and ultimately tragic figure, to Tom Holland's enthusiastic but increasingly isolated protector, the core story remains constant. It's a story about a young man who is given extraordinary abilities, and then, through a series of profoundly personal tragedies and hard-won lessons, learns what it truly means to bear the weight of those gifts. Each Peter Parker, in his own way, comes to understand that responsibility is not a choice you make once. It is a continuous, often painful, commitment. They learn that their powers are not for personal gain or glory, but for the protection of others, even at the cost of their own happiness, their own normalcy, and sometimes their own lives. The quiet moments of sacrifice, the internal struggles, the constant battle against overwhelming odds, these are the threads that weave through every Spider Man story. It's a story about a hero who never truly gets a break, always putting others first, always living with the consequences of his choices. That is enough for tonight. There's plenty more where that came from. Sleep well. It's late now, well past the hour when the city settles into its quieter hum. The streetlights cast long, softened shadows, and the world outside seems to hold its breath. This is the time for slowing down, for letting the day's edges blur. We're not talking tonight about the grand heroic gestures, the city-saving battles, or the sweeping narrative arcs that define most superhero tales. No, what truly distinguishes Spider-Man, what makes him resonate across generations, isn't his strength, his agility, or even his brilliant mind. It wasn't the radioactive spider bite, or the vibrant costume, or the quips that kept villains off balance. It was something far more subtle, more deeply ingrained in his character. It was his financial hardship. It was the constant nagging, utterly ordinary struggle to pay rent, buy groceries, and care for his aging aunt. That's rare. That's genuinely rare. Tonight, we'll trace the thread of this very specific burden through the live action films, understanding how Peter Parker's perpetual, relatable struggle with money isn't just a quirky character trait, but a foundational element that shapes his decisions, his relationships, and ultimately his place as a hero. We'll explore how this mundane stress elevates his extraordinary heroism, making him arguably the most human of all the superpowered individuals. We'll get there without any particular rush. This isn't a countdown. If you find yourself drifting off comfortably, or if these quiet explorations of the stories you love offer a moment of peace, consider subscribing. No pressure. It'll still be here. So let's begin our gentle unwinding of this particular aspect of Peter Parker's story, starting right at the very beginning. When Sam Raimi brought Spider Man to the big screen in 2002, he anchored Tobey Maguire's Peter Parker not just in the fantastical origin of a spider bite, but in the gritty reality of a working class existence in New York City. From his very first appearance, Peter is not just an outsider, he is a young man acutely aware of his family's strained finances. We see his modest home in Forest Hills, the small apartment he shares with his Aunt May and Uncle Ben, a space that clearly speaks of careful budgets and making do. This isn't a mansion, it isn't an opulent penthouse. It's a home, but it is a small one. His early struggle for money is immediately evident. He's a high school student, and like many his age, he's looking for ways to contribute to ease the burden on his aunt and uncle. He works a part-time job, delivering pizzas, a common entry-level position for young people. This job is not glamorous. It is tiring. It is low-paying, and it demands punctuality, a demand that, in a cruel twist of fate, often conflicts with his burgeoning responsibilities as Spider-Man. Think about that for a moment. He loses his job as a pizza delivery driver because he is too busy saving lives. The direct consequence of his heroism is a loss of income, pushing him further into financial precarity. It's a very grounded, very human problem. This financial pressure is a constant undercurrent. When he first discovers his powers, his initial thought isn't about grand heroism, but about how he can use them to make money. He enters a wrestling match, not for glory, but for a cash prize. It's a desperate attempt to alleviate the financial strain, to perhaps buy a used car, to contribute to the household. It's a very understandable, almost universal motivation for a young person in his situation. This pursuit of personal gain, however small, leads directly to the defining tragedy of his life, the death of Uncle Ben. His failure to stop the thief, born from a moment of selfishness regarding his own payment, is compounded by the financial motivation that led him to the wrestling ring in the first place. This financial struggle is not just a backdrop, it is intrinsically linked to his origin story, to the very moment he learns the lesson of great power and great responsibility. The pursuit of money, however benignly intended, had a cost. As Peter transitions to college in Spider-Man 2 sets, the financial strain intensifies. He's juggling classes, a part-time job as a photographer for the Daily Bugle, and his secret life as Spider-Man. The Bugle job is crucial here. J. Jonah Jameson, while a caricature, represents a very real exploitative employer, constantly underpaying Peter for his unique photos of Spider-Man. Peter is providing the Bugle with exclusive, high-demand content, yet he is barely compensated. He lives in a tiny, cramped apartment, falling behind on rent, often relying on the kindness of his landlord. We see him rummaging for coins, struggling to pay for basic necessities. There's a scene where he can't even afford to buy Mary Jane flowers, a small but poignant detail that highlights his constant financial limitations. He's late on rent, he's late to class, he's struggling to make ends meet. Consider the irony here. Spider Man is a hero, saving lives, preventing catastrophic events, yet Peter Parker cannot afford basic living expenses. This stark contrast makes his heroism all the more profound. He's not a billionaire like Batman, funding his operations with an inherited fortune. He's not an alien with no concept of human currency. He is a working class kid, constantly stressed about money, yet he still puts on the suit, still risks his life, still prioritizes the well being of others over his own stability. This struggle grounds him. It makes his sacrifices more tangible, more real. When he considers giving up being Spider Man, the financial relief is a clear, if unspoken, motivator. The burden of being Spider Man isn't just physical, it's also deeply economic. By Spider Man 3 while the core financial struggles persist, the narrative shifts slightly to focus on other pressures. However, the foundation laid in the previous films ensures that Peter's modest means remain a defining aspect of his life. He's still working for the Bugle, still living a relatively humble existence. The wealth and privilege of his friends, like Harry Osborn, serve to highlight Peter's own lack of financial comfort. This constant, quiet comparison reinforces his everyman status. He is not defined by wealth or status, but by his actions and his character, forged in the crucible of both extraordinary responsibility and mundane financial worry. The Amazing Spider Man rebooted the franchise with Andrew Garfield. The focus on Peter Parker's financial struggles became somewhat less explicit, though still present. His initial motivation for using his powers, similar to Tobey Maguire's Peter, involves a degree of self-interest, though not directly for money. He initially uses his abilities to track down those responsible for his uncle's death, a more personal quest. However, the underlying theme of a young man from humble beginnings remains. He's still a high school student living with his aunt and uncle, and while we don't see as much direct evidence of financial strain, the implication of a working class background is clear. Through Sung, the Amazing Spider Man 2 assumes Peter continues to be a high school student, and later, a recent graduate navigating his future. The financial pressures are less about rent and groceries, and more about the uncertainty of a young adult's future. He's not yet established in a career, and the burden of his secret identity continues to complicate his ability to pursue stable employment or education. The film highlights the emotional cost of his heroism more than the financial one, but the two are often intertwined. The struggle to maintain a normal life, which includes financial stability, is a constant challenge. He's still reliant on his aunt, and the lack of a clear path forward for Peter Parker, separate from Spider Man, adds a different kind of pressure. This financial uncertainty, although not as overtly detailed as in the Raimi films, still contributes to Peter's sense of isolation and burden. His life is not one of ease or privilege, it is one of struggle. Moving into the Marvel Cinematic Universe with Tom Holland's Peter Parker, the initial impression might be that the financial struggles are diminished. After all, he receives high-tech suits from Tony Stark and lives in a more modern, slightly more comfortable Queen's apartment. However, the MCU cleverly recontextualizes Peter's financial situation, making it both subtler and in some ways more profound. In Spider-Man: Homecoming, Peter is a high school student, still living with his Aunt May. While Tony Stark provides him with advanced gadgets, Peter's day-to-day life is still very much that of a typical, financially limited teenager. He doesn't have a job, and his allowance, if he has one, is clearly not enough to support his burgeoning superhero life. He has to sneak around, make do with what he has, and his early homemade suit is a testament to his lack of resources. He's not buying fancy equipment, he's scavenging and innovating. The financial aspect here is less about direct poverty and more about resourcefulness born out of necessity. He can't just buy a new web shooter if it breaks, he has to fix it or find a workaround. This makes his ingenuity all the more remarkable. The financial pressure becomes more explicit in Spider-Man: Far From Home. While Peter is on a school trip to Europe, the idea of budget and expenses is a running gag, but it also reflects a reality. He's not traveling first class, he's part of a student group carefully managing his spending. The money for the trip, the souvenirs, the small perks, those all speak to a finite budget. More significantly, his Aunt May is shown to be doing good work for charitable causes, but this often means their personal finances are not robust. They live modestly. The financial stability isn't a given, it's something they work for. And when Peter tries to use the Stark glasses, EDITH, to deal with a rival, the immediate consequence would have been significant property damage, and therefore significant financial cost. He's still navigating a world where money has real consequences. The true culmination of this theme in the MCU comes in Spider Man No Way Home. After his identity is revealed, Peter's life, and by extension, his financial stability, is utterly destroyed. His family is investigated, and his Aunt May loses her job. He, his aunt, and Happy Hogan are forced to move into a smaller, more temporary apartment. He cannot get into college, and his friends struggle to do so because of their association with him. This is not just an inconvenience, it is a complete collapse of their personal and economic security. The consequences of his heroism are not just physical threats, they are deeply personal and financial. And then, of course, the ending. When Peter asks Doctor Strange to cast the spell that makes everyone forget him, he doesn't just sacrifice his relationships, he sacrifices his entire established life, including any semblance of financial stability or a path forward. He is left utterly alone in a tiny, bare apartment with nothing but a cheap, handmade suit. He's buying groceries with cash, and we see him literally struggling to afford basic necessities. Think about that for a moment. He has saved the multiverse, but he is living in poverty. He is now, more than ever, the quintessential friendly neighborhood Spider Man, stripped of all external support, all luxury, all privilege. He is back to square one, but with an immense, quiet understanding of his sacrifice. This return to profound financial hardship is not just a narrative reset, it's a thematic reinforcement. It tells us that Peter Parker's heroism is never born out of comfort or surplus. It is always born out of struggle, out of necessity, out of a deeply ingrained sense of responsibility that transcends personal comfort or economic well being. He is a hero who truly understands the struggles of the people he saves because he lives those struggles himself. This is what makes him so uniquely relatable, so enduringly beloved. He is one of us in the most fundamental and financially strained sense. Looking back across these various interpretations, the thread of Peter Parker's financial struggle is consistently present. From Tobey Maguire's desperate attempts to pay rent and save his pizza delivery job, to Andrew Garfield's implied working class background and the uncertainty of his future, to Tom Holland's ultimate sacrifice that leaves him in profound solitude and financial precarity, the message is clear. Spider Man is not a hero who operates from a position of power or wealth. He is a hero who operates from a position of acute, often painful vulnerability. This vulnerability, rooted in his financial situation, elevates his heroism. When he puts on the suit, he's not just risking his life, he's risking the ability to pay his bills, to support his aunt, to have a future. Every time he swings into action, he's making a choice that might lead to him losing his job, getting evicted, or simply not being able to afford dinner. This constant, mundane pressure makes his extraordinary acts of courage all the more resonant. It makes him deeply human, deeply relatable, and profoundly inspiring. He is a hero who understands the cost of a damaged building, not just in lives, but in livelihoods. He understands the struggle of the common person because he is the common person, just with incredible powers. The story of Spider Man, in all its cinematic iterations, is ultimately the story of a young man who consistently chooses to do the right thing, even when the right thing costs him everything. including his comfort, his stability, and sometimes even his identity. His financial struggle isn't just a detail, it's a core component of his character, reminding us that true heroism often comes from the most unexpected and economically challenged places. It's a quiet burden, but a powerful one, shaping the hero we know and love. That's enough for tonight. There's plenty more where that came from. Sleep well. It's late. The house is quiet now, the small sounds of the day having finally receded into the background, leaving just this space, just you, and the faintest hum of the night. It's a good time for stories, for quiet contemplation, for thinking about how these narratives we so often take for granted are actually constructed layer by careful layer. Today we're going to talk about something specific. Not the grand battles, not the overarching sagas, not the specific moral dilemmas that define a character, but rather the foundational, almost invisible element that often underpins those larger narratives. We're going to talk about the origin stories of superpowers, but not in the way you might expect. Not the moment of the bite, or the exposure, or the alien contact. Not the scientific explanation, or the magical incantation, or the divine intervention. No, we're going to talk about what makes those moments, those origins, stick. We're going to talk about the strange, often overlooked way that the mundane, the accidental, and the deeply personal coalesce into something truly extraordinary. We're going to look at how these moments are crafted, how they resonate, and how they set the stage for everything that follows. We'll get there without any particular rush. This isn't a countdown. This is just a quiet exploration of the quiet architecture of heroism. If you find yourself enjoying these quiet moments, perhaps consider subscribing. No pressure. It'll still be here. So let's begin by looking at the very first cinematic Spider-Man we saw, Tobey Maguire's Peter Parker, and the moment that fundamentally altered his life. In Sam Raimi's Spider-Man from 2002, the narrative structure for Peter's transformation is built with a very deliberate sense of everyday realism. Peter is not a hero in waiting. He is a shy, intelligent, somewhat awkward high school student, deeply immersed in his academic pursuits and navigating the typical social hierarchies of adolescence. His inner world is vibrant, but his outer world is often one of quiet observation, of feeling slightly apart. The key here is that the moment of transformation isn't sought out, it's thrust upon him. During a field trip to a Columbia University genetics lab, Peter is bitten by a genetically engineered super spider. This isn't a heroic quest. This isn't a moment of daring. It's an accident, a completely random, unheroic event. Think about that for a moment. The origins of one of the world's most enduring superheroes are rooted in an accident, a moment of biological chance. It's not a grand, purposeful design. It's a small, almost insignificant detail that in retrospect becomes everything. The spider itself is not mystical. It is scientific, a product of human ingenuity, albeit one that has been tampered with, altered. The bite is a sharp sting, an immediate physiological response. It's a very grounded, almost unglamorous entry point into a world of incredible power. The immediate aftermath of the bite is equally grounded. Peter doesn't immediately gain powers. He feels unwell. He goes home, sleeps, and wakes up to a world that feels both familiar and terrifyingly new. His eyesight, which had been poor, is now perfect. His body has changed. He is stronger, faster, more agile. These are not powers he understands or controls. They are instincts, sudden surges of ability that manifest in everyday situations, catching his lunch tray, avoiding a speeding car. He tests them tentatively in private. He climbs walls in his bedroom, practices swinging through an alley. This period of discovery is crucial. It shows us a Peter who is learning, who is experimenting, who is trying to make sense of something entirely unprecedented in his life. The powers are not immediately heroic. They're simply there. They are a new reality he must contend with. The powers themselves, as depicted in this first film, are organic. The web shooters, notably, are not a technological invention of Peter's, but an organic ability, intrinsic to his new physiology. This choice by Raimi was a significant departure from the comics, where Peter invents mechanical web shooters. But for the narrative of the film, it deepens the sense that these powers are a fundamental, unavoidable part of him. They are not tools he can put on and take off, they are literally woven into his being. This makes his transformation more complete, more irreversible. He doesn't just have powers, he is changed. This accidental bodily transformation sets the stage for the film's central theme. With great power comes great responsibility. The powers are not earned, not desired, not sought. They're given by chance. And because they are given, Peter must decide what to do with them. His initial instinct, as we see, is to use them for personal gain, to win a wrestling match, to impress Mary Jane, to acquire a car. This is a very human response. He is a teenager, grappling with suddenly having immense power in a very ordinary life. It's not until a profound personal tragedy strikes, directly linked to his inaction, that the true weight of his new abilities settles upon him. This origin story, then, is not just about how he got powers, but how he learned to be a hero. The accidental nature of the powers makes the subsequent moral choice all the more poignant. He didn't ask for this, but he must answer for it. Now let's move forward a decade to Mark Webb's The Amazing Spider-Man from 2012, where we see a different Peter Parker, played by Andrew Garfield, and a subtly different, yet equally impactful origin of his abilities. This interpretation shifts the focus from sheer accident to a more layered, almost fated encounter, tying Peter's powers into a larger, more mysterious narrative. Here, Peter is still an intelligent, somewhat outcast high school student, but with a sharper wit and a more pronounced sense of emotional vulnerability. The film immediately establishes his search for answers about his parents, who mysteriously left him with Aunt May and Uncle Ben as a child. This quest for understanding becomes a driving force in his life, and it's this quest that leads him to Oscorp, and specifically to Dr. Kurt Connors, his father's former partner. This is a conscious choice, a deliberate pursuit that places Peter in the path of the spider. The bite itself, in The Amazing Spider-Man, retains the element of surprise, but it is less purely accidental than in the Raimi film. Peter is actively investigating his father's past, exploring restricted areas of Oscorp, driven by a personal mission. He stumbles into a lab filled with genetically modified spiders developed by his father and Connors. He is bitten by one of these spiders, but it feels less like a random happenstance and more like a consequence of his persistent search. It's almost as if the spider and the powers it bestows are an echo of his father's work, a legacy he inadvertently inherits. The spider itself is not just a random lab specimen, it's a product of his family's history, subtly connecting his personal narrative to the source of his abilities. The immediate manifestation of his powers is also distinct. Garfield's Peter experiences a more chaotic, almost violent emergence of his new abilities. He wakes up on a train, displaying incredible strength and agility in a disoriented, almost uncontrollable manner. His powers are raw, animalistic. He struggles to contain them, to understand them. This reflects a Peter who is perhaps more volatile, more prone to emotional outbursts, and whose powers mirror that internal state. His attempts to control them are more about wrestling with an inner force than simply learning to use a new skill. Crucially, in this iteration, the web shooters are not organic. Peter invents them. He uses his scientific genius, his father's notes, and his knowledge of the spider's biology to engineer mechanical devices that can dispense incredibly strong, adhesive web fluid. This decision emphasizes Peter's intellect and resourcefulness. His powers are not just a gift, they are also a product of his own brilliance, his ability to understand and manipulate the scientific principles at play. This makes him an active participant in his own transformation, not just a passive recipient. He creates the tools of his heroism, literally. He engineers the means to harness his newfound abilities. This origin story, then, is about inheritance and invention. Peter inherits a mystery and potentially a destiny from his father. He then invents the means to become the hero he is meant to be. The powers are still transformative, still unexpected, but they are also deeply intertwined with his personal quest for identity and his own scientific aptitude. The responsibility here is not just about using powers wisely, it's also about understanding the legacy that led to those powers and then choosing to build upon it. It's a more active, more intellectual origin, rooted in Peter's relentless pursuit of truth. Finally, we arrive at the most recent cinematic iteration of Spider Man, Tom Holland's Peter Parker, introduced within the Marvel Cinematic Universe. His origin story, while not fully depicted in a dedicated origin film, is retroactively woven into the fabric of his character, and it's arguably the most concise, almost understated of the three. Holland's Spider Man is different in that we don't see his initial bite when he is introduced in Captain America Civil War in 2016. He is already Spider Man. He has already been bitten. He has already developed his powers. He has already been operating as a street level hero in Queens for several months. His origin, therefore, is compressed, implied, and filtered through the lens of a larger, established superhero world. This is a deliberate choice. The MCU, by this point, assumed a certain level of familiarity with Spider Man's core story. We don't need to see the bite again, we know how it happens. What we do see, however, is the aftermath. We see a Peter Parker who has already embraced the friendly neighborhood Spider Man persona. He's balancing high school life with nightly patrols, stopping petty criminals, helping people with small acts of heroism. He's enthusiastic, a little clumsy, and clearly doing it because he believes it's the right thing to do, not because of a direct recent tragedy like Uncle Ben's death, though that tragedy is implied to have happened off screen and is referenced later. His motivation seems to be an inherent youthful idealism, combined with the sheer thrill of having these incredible abilities. In this iteration, the web shooters are, once again, mechanical. Peter invents them. This aligns with the comic book tradition and emphasizes his scientific brilliance. Tony Stark later upgrades these web shooters, providing him with advanced technology, but the initial invention is Peter's own. This establishes him as a genius in his own right, capable of creating complex technology, even before Stark's intervention. His powers, then, are a combination of the biological, the bite, and the technological, his inventions. He merges his inherent abilities with his intellectual prowess. The financial struggle we discussed earlier is also present, but in a slightly different form. Here, Peter is still working with limited resources, making his own suit using his own homemade web fluid. He's not struggling with rent in the same way Maguire's Peter is, but he's operating on a shoestring budget, using his ingenuity to compensate for his lack of funds. This reinforces the idea that Spider Man, even within the glittering world of the Avengers, remains a hero of the people from humble beginnings. This origin, or rather the implied origin, is about self starter heroism and mentorship. Peter is already a hero when we meet him, driven by an internal compass. He then encounters Tony Stark, who becomes a mentor, providing him with resources and guidance. This adds a new layer to the responsibility theme, not just the responsibility that comes with power, but the responsibility that comes with being part of a larger heroic community, and the responsibility to live up to the expectations of a mentor. His powers are a given, almost a backstory detail, allowing the narrative to focus immediately on his journey as a hero within a grander universe. It's less about how he got the powers, and more about what he does with them once he's already started using them. Comparing these three cinematic origin experiences, we see a fascinating evolution. Maguire's Peter receives his powers through pure accident, an almost mystical biological transformation, leading to a profound moral awakening rooted in personal tragedy. Garfield's Peter actively seeks answers, stumbling into his powers through a quest for his past, and then invents the means to harness them, intertwining his intellect with his physical transformation. Holland's Peter begins as Spider Man, his origin a known quantity, allowing the story to focus on his inherent heroism and his integration into a pre existing superhero world, highlighting his ingenuity and his eventual mentorship. Each approach serves the narrative and thematic goals of its respective film series. Raimi's origin emphasizes fate and the burden of unexpected power. Webb's origin highlights personal quest and intellectual agency. The MCU's origin assumes the core story, foregrounding immediate action and the complexities of finding your place in a world already full of heroes. Yet, despite these differences, a common thread persists. The initial power is never truly sought for heroism. It is always a moment of surprise, a disruption of the ordinary that forces a young man to confront extraordinary circumstances. The heroism comes later as a deliberate choice, a response to a new reality. It's this foundational moment of disruption, often accidental, often mundane, that makes these stories resonate so deeply. The ordinary person going about their ordinary life, suddenly imbued with the extraordinary. It's a fantasy we all understand, a wish we all might secretly harbor. And it's the subsequent choice to use that power for good, to shoulder that responsibility, that elevates the character from a simple person with powers to a true hero. It is not the bite that makes Spider Man, but what Peter Parker chooses to do in the days, weeks, and years after it. It is the human element, the moral compass, that transforms a mere biological event into the beginning of a legend. Think about that for a moment. The entire complex tapestry of Spider Man's journey across all these films hinges on a single, almost unremarkable incident: a spider bite, a moment of contact that alters everything. And from that small, almost invisible beginning, entire worlds of heroism, struggle, and sacrifice are built. It's a testament to the power of a simple, well told origin and how it can carry the weight of so much more. There's more coming. There's always more coming. That is enough for tonight. There's plenty more where that came from. Sleep well. Good evening. It's late, and the house has settled into its quiet rhythm. The kind of quiet that lets your thoughts drift, unhurried, like leaves on a slow stream. I hope you're comfortable, perhaps with a warm blanket, as we turn our attention to the tangled web of Spider Man's cinematic journey. We're going to trace the full arc of the cinematic Spider Man, not as a series of disconnected films, but as a continuous narrative tapestry woven with recurring themes and evolving interpretations. We won't be dissecting box office numbers or critical reception. We're not cataloging villains or ranking suits. No. What we'll be doing is observing how the core essence of Spider Man, the very idea of Peter Parker, has been refracted through different creative lenses, each revealing a slightly different facet of the same brilliant gem. It's about the consistent heart of the character, despite the changing faces and shifting universes. We'll get there without any particular rush. This isn't a countdown. This is a quiet exploration, a gentle unwinding of the story threads that connect these films from the very first glimpse of Tobey Maguire in 2002 to the multiversal echoes of Tom Holland's most recent outing. We'll trace the lineage of his struggles, his triumphs, and the ever-present weight of his responsibility. If you find yourself enjoying this quiet corner of the internet, you might consider subscribing. No pressure. It'll still be here. For now, let's cast our minds back to the early 2000s, to a time when superhero films were still finding their footing before the sprawling interconnected universes became the norm. The year 2002. Sam Raimi's Spider-Man arrived, a film that, in many ways, set the template for the superhero origin story. It introduced us to Tobey Maguire's Peter Parker, a shy, somewhat awkward high school student from Queens. His life, at first, was defined by his unrequited crush on Mary Jane Watson, his unwavering friendship with Harry Osborn, and the relentless bullying he endured. He was a character as instantly recognizable, instantly relatable. He wasn't born into privilege. He wasn't a super soldier experiment. He was just Peter. The fateful spider bite, a radioactive arachnid escaping a genetic research lab, was the catalyst. It was a moment of pure accident, a random event that irrevocably altered his biology. The physical changes were immediate: enhanced strength, agility, the ability to cling to surfaces. But the true transformation was internal. This isn't just about powers, it's about what those powers demand. His initial reaction to these newfound abilities wasn't altruism. It was rather a very human, very teenage desire for personal gain or retribution. He tests his powers, contemplating a boxing match for prize money, a decision driven by a desire for a new car to impress Mary Jane. It was a fleeting, almost petty ambition, and it led directly to the profound tragedy that shapes his entire being: the death of Uncle Ben. With great power comes great responsibility. This phrase, spoken by Uncle Ben, became the moral compass for Raimi's Peter. It wasn't just a line of dialogue, it was the cornerstone of his identity. The death of Uncle Ben, a direct consequence of Peter's inaction, his selfish choice to let a thief escape, was the crucible in which Spider Man was forged. It was a heavy price, a burden he would carry through all three films. This wasn't merely a superhero origin, it was a coming of age story, a tale of learning the hard way, of understanding the profound weight of one's choices. The first film then established the core conflict: Peter Parker's ordinary life versus Spider Man's extraordinary responsibilities. His love for Mary Jane, his friendship with Harry, his academic pursuits, all constantly threatened by the demands of his superhero identity. We see him struggle with the secrecy, the isolation, the constant fear of hurting those he loves. The Green Goblin, Norman Osborn, represented a twisted reflection, a powerful figure succumbing to his darker impulses. The fight against him was not just physical, it was a moral battle for the soul of the city and for Peter's own sense of purpose. The film ends with Peter choosing responsibility over personal happiness, a pattern that would define his journey. Then we transition to 2004 and Spider Man 2 Its Sakes, often hailed as the pinnacle of the series. Here, the struggle intensifies. Peter is older, more experienced, but also more burdened. The weight of being Spider Man is crushing him. He's failing at college, losing his job, his friendships are strained, and his relationship with Mary Jane is faltering. He's constantly late, constantly absent, always putting the needs of the city before his own. The film explores the profound personal cost of heroism. Peter, at one point, even loses his powers, a physical manifestation of his emotional and mental exhaustion. He wants to be free of the burden. He yearns for a normal life, a life where he can be with Mary Jane without constant fear and sacrifice. This segment of the story is vital. It shows us that even a hero, especially a hero defined by his sense of duty, can falter, can question his path. It makes him more human, more relatable. Dr. Octopus, Otto Octavius, was the antagonist here, a brilliant scientist corrupted by his own invention. His story mirrors Peter's in a tragic way, a powerful individual grappling with the consequences of his creations, though Octavius succumbs to the darker aspects, the unbridled ambition. The climax, with Peter saving the train and then battling Doc Ock, is a powerful reaffirmation of his commitment. He chooses to be Spider-Man, not because it's easy, but because it's right. The film ends with Mary Jane discovering his secret, adding another layer of complexity to his double life. The third film, Spider-Man 3 O's, released in 2007, brought a more complex narrative, introducing multiple villains and exploring the darker aspects of Peter's own character. The arrival of the symbiote, an extraterrestrial organism, amplifies his negative traits, his arrogance, his anger, his desire for revenge against Flint Marko, the Sandman, whom he believes was truly responsible For Uncle Ben's death, this is a crucial exploration of the hero's shadow. Peter, under the influence of the symbiote, becomes self serving, even cruel. He hurts Mary Jane, lashes out at Harry, and revels in his newfound power. This period allows us to see how easily even the noblest intentions can be corrupted, how tempting it is to give in to darker impulses, especially when fueled by grief and anger. The story challenges the audience to question what truly defines a hero. Is it simply power, or is it the choices made with that power? The internal struggle, the fight against his own darkness, is as significant as any physical confrontation. He eventually sheds the symbiote, realizing its corrupting influence, but not before it creates Venom, a monstrous reflection of his own power taken to a destructive extreme. The film culminates in a battle where Peter, with the help of a redeemed Harry Osborn, confronts both Sandman and Venom, ultimately forgiving Marco and choosing empathy over vengeance. It was a messy, sprawling film, but it ultimately reinforced the core message of responsibility and the constant need for self reflection and moral integrity. The ending, with Peter and Mary Jane attempting to move forward, felt like a quiet, hopeful resolution to his specific journey. After a few years, a new interpretation emerged. In 2012, we were introduced to Andrew Garfield's Peter Parker in The Amazing Spider Man. This reboot offered a different origin, a different tone, and a different Peter. This Peter, while still intelligent and somewhat socially awkward, possessed a distinct rebellious streak, a more sardonic wit, and a stronger sense of individual agency. His origin story was less about a random accident and more about a deliberate quest. He was searching for answers about his parents, who mysteriously disappeared when he was young. This quest leads him to Oscorp, to the genetically altered spiders, and to his eventual powers. Unlike Maguire's Peter, who is more passive in his transformation, Garfield's Peter actively seeks out the source, driven by a need to understand his past. The death of Uncle Ben still serves as the pivotal moment, but here the guilt is perhaps even more acutely felt, as Peter had a direct confrontation with the thief before letting him escape. The responsibility, therefore, feels even more personal, more immediate. His initial vigilantism is driven by this guilt, a raw, almost reckless pursuit of justice. This series introduced Gwen Stacy as his primary love interest, a character who was brilliant, confident, and an equal to Peter in many ways. Their relationship was central to the narrative, providing a different dynamic than the Maguire-Dunst pairing. It was a more intellectual, more playful connection, but also one fraught with the dangers of Peter's secret life. The Lizard, Dr. Kurt Connors, was the antagonist, another scientist whose ambition leads to monstrous consequences, echoing the themes of power and responsibility, but through a more scientific lens. This film ends with Peter embracing his role, but also with the lingering question of his promise to Captain Stacy to stay away from Gwen. The Amazing Spider-Man 2-6, released in 2014, continued this more youthful, emotionally charged interpretation. Peter is grappling with his promise to Captain Stacy, his love for Gwen, and the ever-present threat to New York. The film amplifies the emotional stakes, focusing heavily on the romance between Peter and Gwen, making her fate all the more impactful. We see a Peter who is more confident as Spider-Man, even enjoying the role at times, but still profoundly struggling with the personal sacrifices it demands. Electro Max Dillon emerges as a new threat, a lonely, overlooked individual transformed into a powerful villain, a tragic figure whose resentment makes him dangerous. The Green Goblin, Harry Osborn, appears as well, furthering the idea of a legacy of villains tied to Oscorp and Peter's own family history. The climactic battle and the subsequent death of Gwen Stacy is perhaps the defining moment of the series. It was a brutal, heartbreaking loss, a direct consequence of his life as Spider-Man. This event shatters Peter, leading to a period of deep mourning and a temporary retreat from his superhero identity. It's a moment of profound darkness, a powerful reminder that even with great power, some tragedies cannot be prevented, some costs are too high. It emphasized the idea that Peter Parker's life is one of perpetual sacrifice, that even his greatest loves can be taken from him. The film ends with Peter, still grieving, choosing to return to his role, understanding that the city still needs him, even as his heart is broken. The sense of loss, the raw emotion in Garfield's performance, left a lasting impression. Then, after another hiatus, Spider Man entered a new era, integrated into the sprawling Marvel Cinematic Universe. Tom Holland's Peter Parker first appeared in Captain America Civil War in 2016. This was a radical departure. His origin story was already known, a given. He was already Spider Man, active in Queens, making homemade suits. Tony Stark, Iron Man, discovers him, recruits him, and provides him with advanced technology, effectively making him a protege and an Avenger in training. This approach bypassed the traditional origin story entirely, allowing the narrative to focus immediately on Peter's integration into a world already populated by superheroes. His struggle was less about acquiring powers and more about finding his place, proving his worth, and navigating the complexities of mentorship under Tony Stark. The great power, great responsibility mantra was still present, but it was often filtered through Tony's guidance or through Peter's own earnest desire to live up to the example of the Avengers. Spider Man Homecoming, released in 2017, fully established Holland's solo journey. This Peter is younger, more enthusiastic, and perhaps a bit naive. His primary goal is to become a full fledged Avenger, to be seen as more than just the friendly neighborhood Spider Man. The film focuses on his local heroics, his attempts to balance high school life with his superhero aspirations, and his relationship with Tony Stark. The Vulture, Adrian Toomes, was a grounded, relatable villain, a blue-collar worker driven to crime by the very actions of the Avengers. This made the conflict personal for Peter, as he was fighting someone who felt wronged by the very heroes he admired. The film's climax, where Peter rejects the advanced suit from Tony and relies on his own ingenuity and his homemade suit, is a significant moment. It underscores the idea that the hero isn't the suit, it's the person inside. It's a subtle nod back to the core idea of responsibility, but framed through the lens of earning his place, rather than simply accepting a burden. The discovery of his identity by Aunt May at the very end set up new challenges. Next, in 2019, Spider Man Far From Home took Peter out of New York and into a post Endgame world. Tony Stark was gone, a profound loss that left a massive void in Peter's life. He was struggling with grief, with the expectation to become the next Iron Man, and with his desire for a normal summer vacation with his friends, particularly MJ. Mysterio Quentin Beck emerges as a manipulative figure, exploiting Peter's grief and his desire to escape responsibility. Beck presents himself as a hero from another dimension, a mentor figure, preying on Peter's vulnerability and his need for guidance. This film explores the theme of perception versus reality, of truth and deception. Peter, still young and grappling with his own identity, is easily manipulated by Beck, leading to moments of doubt and self-blame. The climax, where Peter has to confront Mysterio's illusions and rely on his spidey sense and his own judgment, is another step in his evolution. It's about learning to trust himself, to forge his own path, rather than trying to fill someone else's shoes. The post-credits scene, however, was a game changer. Mysterio frames Spider-Man for his death and reveals his secret identity to the entire world. This moment thrust Peter into uncharted territory, facing public scrutiny and becoming a fugitive. It was the biggest cliffhanger the character had faced yet, which brings us to 2021 and Spider-Man: No Way Home, a film that paid homage to the entire cinematic legacy of Spider-Man. With his identity revealed, Peter's life and the lives of those he loves are irrevocably shattered. He seeks out Doctor Strange to cast a spell that will make everyone forget he is Spider-Man, a desperate attempt to restore the peace he lost. But the spell goes awry, tearing open the fabric of the multiverse and bringing villains from previous Spider Man iterations into his world: Green Goblin, Dr. Octopus, Electro, Sandman, and the Lizard. This wasn't just a fan service moment, it was a profound thematic exploration. Peter, burdened with a fresh wave of responsibility, feels compelled to cure these villains, to save them from their destined deaths, rather than simply sending them back to their own universes. This decision, driven by his inherent good nature and his empathy, leads to even greater chaos and tragedy. The arrival of Tobey Maguire's and Andrew Garfield's Spider-Man through the fractured multiverse was a pivotal moment. It allowed for a conversation across generations of the character, a shared understanding of the burden of the mask. The three Peters, each having faced their own unique struggles and losses, come together to help each other to heal each other. Garfield's Peter finally gets a moment of redemption for Gwen's death by saving MJ. Maguire's Peter offers wisdom and a calm presence, having endured similar hardships. The film culminates in Peter making the ultimate sacrifice, asking Doctor Strange to cast a spell that makes everyone, including his friends and Aunt May, forget Peter Parker ever existed. It's a heartbreaking decision, an act of pure, selfless love, an echo of the great responsibility that has defined every incarnation of the character. He chooses complete anonymity, a life of isolation, to protect those he cares about. It's a full circle moment, a return to the lonely hero, but now with the wisdom and experience of having lost everything. He crafts a new, simpler suit, a symbol of his renewed commitment to being the friendly neighborhood Spider-Man, without the trappings of fame or the burden of a known identity. And so, we've traced a path through 2 decades of Spider-Man films. From the earnest, burdened hero of Raimi's vision, to the witty, emotionally raw Peter of Webb's series, to the eager, tragic figure of Holland's MCU journey. Each interpretation, while distinct, has consistently explored the same core ideas: the unexpected burden of power, the profound weight of responsibility, the constant sacrifice of personal happiness for the greater good, and the enduring human spirit that chooses to do what is right, even when it costs everything. The faces change, the villains shift, the universes diverge, but the heart of Peter Parker, the boy who chooses to be a hero, remains steadfast. It's a testament to the enduring power of a character who, despite his extraordinary abilities, remains fundamentally, beautifully human. Think about that for a moment. The entire complex tapestry of Spider-Man's journey across all these films hinges on a single, almost unremarkable incident: a spider bite, a moment of contact that alters everything. And from the small, almost invisible beginning, entire worlds of heroism, struggle, and sacrifice are built. It's a testament to the power of a simple, well-told origin, and how it can carry the weight of so much more. There's more coming, there's always more coming. That is enough for tonight. There's plenty more where that came from. Sleep well. Good evening. It's late, or perhaps very early, depending on your perspective, and the house is quiet now. The day has receded, leaving only the soft hum of the night. We're here again in this particular stillness. Tonight, we're going to step away just slightly and from the webs and the cityscapes, and we're going to consider something a little different, something that often operates in the shadows or in the stark, blinding light of a city's skyline. We're going to talk about Batman, not the Batman of the comics, not the endless iterations of the animated series, not the Batman who is a myth, exactly, but the Batman who has been brought to life in various ways on the silver screen. More specifically, we're going to look at how different filmmakers have approached the essential question of Bruce Wayne's trauma, and how that trauma has shaped the very specific kind of hero he becomes. It wasn't the cape, not the cowl, not the gadgets or the car. It was the stark, unrelenting, utterly consuming grief of a child witnessing an unspeakable act that forged this particular icon. We'll trace a path through the major cinematic interpretations, from the gothic grandeur of Tim Burton's vision to the grounded grit of Christopher Nolan's trilogy, and then on to the more recent, raw, and almost painfully human portrayal we've seen. We'll explore how each film, or series of films, grapples with the fundamental darkness at Batman's core, and how that darkness defines his heroism. We'll get there without any particular rush. This isn't a countdown. If you find yourself settling in with these thoughts, perhaps consider subscribing. No pressure, it'll still be here. So let's begin our journey back to Gotham, a city perpetually shrouded in a kind of twilight, a place where light and shadow are in constant dramatic conflict. Our first stop is 1989, Tim Burton's Batman. This film arrived after a significant period of dormancy for the character on screen, following the campy, bright, and overtly comedic television series. Burton's vision was a stark departure, a return to the character's darker, detective roots, but filtered through his unique Gothic aesthetic. Here, Gotham is a character unto itself, a sprawling Art Deco nightmare, perpetually shrouded in smoke and oppressive architecture. The trauma of Bruce Wayne, as depicted here, is foundational but almost operatic in its presentation. We see the murder of his parents, Thomas and Martha Wayne, in a flashback, a pivotal moment that fuels his entire existence. But it's not lingered on with raw psychological detail. Instead, it's a stylized, almost mythic origin. The young Bruce witnesses the crime, and the scene is framed with a kind of darkly romantic horror, setting the tone for the entire film. Michael Keaton's Bruce Wayne is a man of quiet intensity, almost withdrawn, his aristocratic facade a thin veil over a churning interior. His Batman persona is the true expression of his rage and his quest for order. What's crucial here is the direct link established between the killer of his parents and the Joker. Jack Nicholson's Joker, a flamboyant, destructive force, is revealed to be Jack Napier, the very man who gunned down the Waynes. This direct connection simplifies Batman's motivation, making his mission intensely personal. It's not just about justice for Gotham, it's about a specific, deeply etched personal vendetta. This choice gives the film a clear narrative drive, a singular antagonist to encapsulate all of Batman's past pain. The Joker becomes the embodiment of the chaos that shattered Bruce's childhood, and Batman's fight against him is a direct confrontation with his own defining tragedy. The film doesn't delve deeply into the psychological repercussions of this trauma beyond its direct manifestation as Batman. It's more about the consequence of that trauma on the city, on the larger-than-life figures it produces. The focus is on the spectacle, the grand theatricality of their conflict. Think about that for a moment. This direct link, it provides a clean narrative, a clear antagonist. But it also, perhaps, simplifies the complex, pervasive nature of trauma. It makes it a problem to be solved, a villain to be defeated, rather than an internal landscape to be navigated. Moving forward, with Joel Schumacher's two films, Batman Forever and Batman and Robin, the thematic exploration of trauma largely recedes, replaced by a more colorful, campy, and toy-line-friendly approach. While Bruce Wayne's past is acknowledged, particularly in Batman Forever, with the introduction of Robin and the shared experience of loss, it's not the driving psychological engine. The films prioritize spectacle and a lighter tone, pushing the darker elements of the character to the background. They represent a significant shift away from the gothic introspection and towards a more overtly commercial aesthetic. We don't need to linger there long for our purposes. They were a momentary detour. Then came Christopher Nolan's Batman Begins. In 2005, a film that radically redefined the character for a new generation and set a new standard for superhero storytelling. Nolan's approach was grounded, realistic, attempting to answer the question, how would a Batman exist in our world? And central to that question is a deep, unflinching look at Bruce Wayne's trauma. From the very beginning, the film immerses us in Bruce's childhood fear, specifically his phobia of bats, which later becomes a symbol of his vigilantism. We witness the murder of his parents in excruciating detail, a moment of profound, shattering loss. It's not stylized, it's brutal and sudden, leaving a young Bruce utterly adrift. This film meticulously builds Batman from the ground up, showing Bruce's journey through grief, rage, and self discovery. He travels the world, seeking to understand the criminal mind, to overcome his own fear, and to transform himself into something more than a man. Nolan's Bruce Wayne, portrayed by Christian Bale, is a man perpetually haunted. His trauma isn't just an origin story, it's an active wound, a constant presence. He grapples with the guilt of feeling responsible for his parents' death, a common, often irrational psychological burden for a child who loses a parent. His entire crusade is an attempt to process that primal injustice, to prevent others from suffering the same fate. The film explores the idea that Batman isn't just a hero, he's a manifestation of Bruce's unresolved pain. His mission is a coping mechanism, a way to channel his immense suffering into a productive, albeit extreme, purpose. The strength of Nolan's approach lies in its psychological realism. We see Bruce wrestle with his inner demons, his moments of doubt, his struggle to maintain a normal life while consumed by his vigilante identity. The film doesn't offer easy answers. It portrays Batman as a man constantly pushing himself to the brink, driven by an almost obsessive need to rectify the past. His trauma is not a plot device, it's the very fabric of his being, informing every decision, every sacrifice. It's a powerful, almost tragic portrayal of a hero who cannot escape his past, but chooses to use it as fuel for his fight. In The Dark Knight, the trauma continues to be a driving force, but it evolves. Bruce has become Batman, and the film explores the consequences of that choice. The Joker here is not directly linked to the Wayne's murder, which allows the film to explore a different kind of trauma. The trauma of an ongoing war, the psychological toll of being Gotham's protector. Batman faces escalating threats, and the film examines the moral compromises and personal sacrifices required to maintain order in a city constantly on the brink. The trauma here is less about the past and more about the present, the constant erosion of self in the service of a greater, seemingly unending conflict. And then, in The Dark Knight Rises, we see the lingering effects of a life dedicated to this war. Bruce Wayne is broken, physically and emotionally. His body bears the scars of his battles, and his spirit is weary. The film forces him to confront his past again, to find a way to heal, to move beyond the singular identity of Batman. His journey from brokenness to redemption, symbolized by his escape from the pit and his eventual retirement from vigilantism, is a direct engagement with his long-held trauma. He finally finds a way to live, to move forward, to let go of the pain that defined him for so long. It's a powerful, albeit ambiguous, resolution to a deep psychological arc. So let's think about it. Nolan showed us a Batman who was built from trauma, constantly engaged in a battle not just with criminals, but with his own past. Now we move to 2016, to Zack Snyder's Batman v Superman, Dawn of Justice. Here, Ben Affleck's Batman is an older, more jaded version, one who has been fighting for decades. His trauma is presented as something that has festered, leading to a darker, more brutal form of vigilantism. We see the murder of his parents again, in slow motion, almost ritualistic, emphasizing the cyclical nature of his pain. This Batman has lost faith in humanity, has become disillusioned, and his methods reflect this deep-seated weariness and anger. The film connects his trauma to his present actions in a visceral way. His fear and paranoia, fueled by his past losses and the arrival of Superman, lead him to a path of extreme violence. His personal tragedy has not been resolved. It has metastasized, influencing his perception of the world and pushing him towards increasingly desperate measures. The Martha moment where he recognizes Superman's shared humanity through the commonality of their mothers' names, is a direct, if somewhat abrupt, attempt to bridge this gap, to remind him of the very human origins of his own pain. It's a moment that briefly cuts through the hardened shell of his trauma, allowing a flicker of empathy to break through. This portrayal offers a Batman who is worn down by his past, not just driven by it. His trauma has not made him noble, it has made him dangerous, perhaps even broken. It's a stark contrast to Nolan's hopeful, if arduous, path to eventual peace. And finally, we arrive at Matt Reeves, the Batman, in 2022. This film offers a fresh, almost painfully intimate look at Bruce Wayne's trauma. Robert Pattinson's Bruce is young, still very much in the early years of his vigilantism, and profoundly, visibly wounded. His parents' murder is not just an origin, it's a living, breathing wound, a constant presence in every frame. He narrates his own story, offering direct access to his internal turmoil. This Bruce Wayne is barely functioning as a socialite. He's a recluse, haunted by the past, obsessed with his mission to the point of self destruction. His trauma is raw, unvarnished. He lives in the shadows, not just as Batman, but as Bruce Wayne. The film delves into the idea that his identity as Batman is not just a uniform, but a complete absorption of his personality. He hasn't processed his grief. He has channeled it directly into his crusade, becoming a creature of the night, driven by a rage that often borders on uncontrolled. What's particularly striking here is how the film explores the legacy of his parents, the question of whether their actions or reputation contributed to their demise, and how that impacts Bruce's understanding of his own mission. He's not just fighting crime, he's trying to understand the corruption that led to his parents' death and how that corruption continues to plague Gotham. His personal trauma is inextricably linked to the city's systemic rot. The film suggests that his trauma has made him almost feral, a force of nature, rather than a refined detective. He's impulsive, driven by instinct and anger, making mistakes, and learning painful lessons. The ending of The Batman suggests a turning point. After the cataclysmic flooding of Gotham, Bruce begins to understand that his mission cannot be solely about vengeance. He sees the need for hope, for light, for guiding the people of Gotham out of the darkness. It's a subtle shift, but a significant one, hinting at a path towards healing, a way to move beyond the all-consuming nature of his initial trauma and towards a more complete, a more empathetic form of heroism. He's still wounded, deeply so, but there's a glimmer of understanding that his pain can be transformed, not just endlessly reenacted. And so, we've journeyed through these different cinematic interpretations of Batman, always circling back to that singular moment in Crime Alley. Each director, each actor, has grappled with the question of how to portray a man defined by such profound loss. From Burton's Gothic tragedy, where trauma is the mythic catalyst, to Nolan's psychological realism, where it's the enduring fuel, to Snyder's portrayal of its corrosive effects, and finally to Reeves's raw, visceral depiction of its immediate, all-consuming power. The common thread is always the boy in the alley, the child who watched his world shatter. But the variations lie in how that shattering reshapes the man. Is he a symbol of justice, a broken avenger, a force of nature, or a man perpetually trying to outrun his own past? Each film offers a different answer, a different perspective on the enduring burden of being Bruce Wayne. It's a testament to the character's depth that these varying approaches can all resonate, can all feel true in their own way. The core of his heroism isn't his strength or his gadgets, but his unwavering commitment to never let what happened to him happen to anyone else, even if it costs him everything. That's rare. That's genuinely rare. There's more coming. There's always more coming. That is enough for tonight. There's plenty more where that came from. Sleep well.